session. This is a session on the overview of Asian philosophy, and we are extremely happy to have two pioneers in this field, Professor Brian Van Norden, Chair of Philosophy at Vassar College, and Stelios Virdakis, Stelios, always with your surname, Stelios Virdakis, Professor of Philosophy at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Thank you very much. Brian.
Well, thank you all for coming today. There's so many people to thank, but I'll just briefly thank Jeffrey Sachs and also the wonderful Academy of Athens. It's really awe-inspiring to be here. There's many things we're going to be talking about today, but I'll just briefly say that when it comes to comparisons of Western and non-Western philosophy, people tend to go to two extremes. They either tend to notice the similarities and assimilate different traditions, or they tend to notice the differences and treat traditions as completely incommensurable. And I'm part of a school of thought that likes to look for, in the words of my teacher, Lee Yearley at Stanford, similarities in differences and differences in similarities. That is to say, you look for the genuine similarities but aren't afraid of the differences you find, and you identify differences but don't find it necessary to ignore the similarities that sometimes appear among those genuine differences. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker. Bishop Marcello will be talking on Aristotle and theology in 10 minutes.
Thank you. I am very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Jeffrey Sachs, for the Academy of Sciences, Academy of Athens, and good morning for everyone, and especially for the friends that are here. Of course, I can speak in 10 minutes, but I sent my text. If you want to read my text, it's more developed than the things that I can say in this moment. But look, it's very important, because in the end, for Aristotle, all depends on God. Because for me, the miracle that made Aristotle and the Greeks, but especially Aristotle, is the distinction. He speaks about the Aephoria, distinction between God, between the human being, and between the other beings, the other living beings, and the other beings that do not have life. So this great distinction, of course, in a holistic way, but there are distinctions. It's not the same God, it's not the same the human being, it's not the same the other living beings. This is one thing. The second thing, Aristotle is the founder of the reality of the movement. We can say Aristotle has the metaphysical, the ontological foundation of the sustainable development. Without Aristotle, we can't speak about the development in reality, because for the physicists before Aristotle, Parmenides, and the interpretation of Parmenides, the movement is not nothing real, it's apparent. And this, I think, also in many other considerations of Confucius. We don't have the text of Confucius. I don't am a specialist in Confucius. In the contrary, I know Aristotle by memory many texts. So, but really, we don't have independently of Aristotle, a theory of the movement. So, and Aristotle, with this act and potency, also today, when we speak about resilience, we speak about the potentiality, the ability. Also, when we speak of sustainable development, Aristotle is the first to have the theory of the reality of this. So, but I go to my subject, that is God, Aristotle made a very important distinction for the first time. And see, because God is a reality that we can see, because it's a not material reality. You see, we need to prove the existence. And it's fair to say we need to prove the existence of God. It's not an immediately perception that we have for the other things that are composed of matter. So, and the second really more genial enlightenment of Aristotle is the idea of God. God, we say technically, the perfection of God. What is the nature of God? And for Aristotle, the nature of God, for the first time, is not something negative to say, is immortal, so not half dead, or no, it's a positive idea, it's a positive notion that comes from our activity, especially for the activity of the intellect. So, in the hypothesis of Aristotle, the nature of God is to understand, and his substance, his reality is in understand. Understand all things, and understanding produce the first movement of all things, because all things go to God for a sort of attraction of the good, because this intellection is good also. It's the first good, and this is Plato. But so this is the question. So, in concretely, and I finish. I have more time. Okay. If I have more time, we can say, look, this is very important because he proposed some distinction between God and the thing that we say creation, that is a real creation. So, and this is very important in the Western, in relation with the other cultures, especially Asia, especially Confucian. Of course, Confucian have a great ethics, and in this part is very, we can put in relation of Aristotle. But in the idea of the world, and in the components of the world, the idea of creation, that for the big theologian, also San Dionys the Areopagite. We have near here the church of San Dionys Areopagite, and was the first father of the church to take Aristotle as master. So it's very important. I prayed this morning in San Dionys Areopagite, here, near, very nice church. So one of the big church of the Athens. So, and as Saint Dionys, Aristotle have the idea of creation. That is to say, that things depend of God, depend in his entity, and depend in his finality, and depend in his movement, in his being and his operations. This dependency of God is the idea of creation. Look, the Christian act, the creation is in the time. So we create the things in some times. But this is not the idea of Aristotle. No. But the creation, yes. And I think this idea of creation, this separation in some sense, at the same time of immanence, that separation, is very important in the relation with the other civilization. So, for these things, I think that the miracle that made the Greek is the Aephoria between God, between the human being, between the other beings. And this all depends of God by attraction of the good. And God is this entity, this substance that think and love, and because think and love move all the things. So this is really the more important question. I don't want to put my more ideas because it's really complicated, but I want to propose this as absolutely question. The great distinction between God, the human being, and the other beings is the real miracle that made the grace. Thank you.
That was wonderfully concise and clear. A miracle in itself to talk about so much in Aristotle. I should have mentioned that Bishop Marcello is the outgoing Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican. And our next speaker is Tao Zhang, a friend of mine and also chair of the Religion Department and director of the Center for Chinese Studies at Rutgers University. While he's getting the PowerPoint ready, I'll note that we should have time for questions, but I'm going to hold the questions to the end just in case we have any technical problems or delays so that we can make the best use of our time. But so keep in mind your questions you have for all the speakers.
Hello. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this exciting conversation. So today I'm going to talk about the Zhuangzi's idea of personal freedom. Zhuangzi is generally believed to be somebody living in the 3rd century BCE in early China. There's a well-known story in the Zhuangzi, the fable of a frog and the whale. It's a conversation between a whale frog and a sea turtle. The frog brags about his own comfortable abode and way of life in a caved-in well to a visiting sea turtle. When the turtle described to the frog what the sea is like, the frog is completely dumbfounded, right? Not knowing what to make of the turtle's description. And this is a tale about the limited world of the whale for the frog, in contrast with the limitless world of the sea for the turtle. Now, if the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic has shaped Western approaches to knowledge, truth, reality, ethics, and politics, the fable of a frog and the whale has played a similar kind of role in Chinese intellectual history. So here I echo Brian saying that it's similarity in differences, differences in similarity. The two, clearly that both the whale and the cave are problematic, but for actually slightly different reasons. Whereas the illusion versus reality is the primary setup in the cave. It is the limitedness versus limitlessness in the whale that is the primary setup, right? So the tension is quite different in subtle ways. Limitedness or smallness versus limitlessness or capaciousness is a foundational paradigm in Chinese philosophical reasoning. Now, Zhuangzi, in his case, he mocked the Confucian and the Moist for being like frogs in a well, while at the same time, he's the one who extolled the virtual roaming in the world of limitlessness, like in the sea. Now, importantly, unlike Plato's portrayal of people shackled in the cave, Zhuangzi's critique of the frog is not that its world is unreal, but rather that its perspective is limited. For Zhuangzi, the Confucians, the Moists, were limited by their narrowly moralistic perspective on everything. As we know, the Confucians and the Moists were the dominant players in early Chinese moral political debate about how to build an orderly and fulfilling world amidst increasing chaos and violence in early China. The mainstream debate was a contestation between what I called conceptions of two moral obligations, humaneness and justice. Humaneness is a partialist conception of moral obligation embraced by the Confucians, and justice is an impartialist conception advocated by the Moists and others. So almost all the mainstream philosophers were debating along those lines, except Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi did not quite accept the term of that debate. He actually dismissed the parameters of this humaneness and justice as confining and even harmful. Instead, he was a strong advocate for personal freedom expansive in its imagination, but deeply ambivalent about the state. At its core, the Zhuangist project, or personal freedom, was a challenge to the centrality of ritual norms in the Confucian construction of the life world, the constricting well in the fable. Ritual was a system of rules, codes, and conventions that regulated every aspect of human life in China, from the sacred funeral rituals to mundane daily routines, from solemn state rituals of sacrifice to heaven to the ordinary personal daily interactions. The Zhuangzi's musing about personal freedom had to negotiate the boundaries and the rules that's set by ubiquitous ritual norms and practices. Okay. So Zhuangzi's freedom operates in two kinds of space, inside and outside the life world that's constituted by ritual. So the life world is constituted by ritual, and Zhuangzi's notion operates both inside and outside of that life world. Now, as shown by the sea turtle and its world of limitlessness in the fable, roaming outside the life world is the paradigmatic Zhuangzi's freedom. Expressions of this kind of roaming are ubiquitous in text. For example, in expressions like roaming between heaven and earth, roaming into the infinite, beyond the four seas, beyond the dust and grime, and so forth, right? These are fantastic. There's another expression of personal freedom in the text that explores ways to navigate life within the life world, and this is the second kind of roaming. It's subtler, but no less compelling. And this, the celebrated story of the butcher cook Din offers the most illuminating example of this distinct Zhuangist personal freedom within the life world. So the cook Din is portrayed as somebody who's performing a fantastic feat of untangling a massive, intricate body of an ox. With charming details and poetic flair, the story describes the butcher's supremely attuned senses and Tao-guided actions when running his chopper through the ox body. His every touch and every move is conducted in perfect rhythm, as if he was performing some grand ancient ritual, a highly scripted and constrained occasion. His execution is exquisite and precise, hitting all the right notes while smoothly cutting open the ox body without hacking his way through. Now, the butcher turned out to be quite a philosopher. He explained to the awestruck Lord Wenhui that he cares more about the Tao than mere skill. The butcher described the different phases of learning the craft of butchery in terms of different perceptions that become available to him as he deepens his knowledge of the ox body. Gradually, he starts to discern, at the very beginning, he sees the whole ox unable to cope with the intricacy of the complex bodily structure. Gradually, he starts to discern bone and muscle patterns, which makes his work easier as he can follow along those patterns without having to constantly hack his way through. Eventually, he discovered that there's actually hidden paths inside the ox, even though they're invisible to untrained eyes. As a result, he has not changed his chopper for 19 years, whereas even good butchers have to change theirs every year. Now, what's extraordinary is cook Din's discernment of a space in a joint and his realization of the thickness in his chopper. Neither is apparent from an ordinary perspective. In his long years of practice, he has been transformed as a butcher. As a result, the hidden space within the ox joint is brought into the open, enabling him to run his chopper through as if it had no thickness. Lord Wenhui, after watching the butcher's performance and listening to his explanation, notes that he has learned an invaluable lesson about how to nurture life from a butcher in his art of butchery. Right? So clearly, the ox is meant to be a metaphor for the intricacy and complexity of the life world. The bones and joints symbolize the rules and the norms of the life world that should not be violated. So, and the butcher here is portrayed as somebody who's very skillful in navigating this very intricate life world that's constituted by ritual. So this is the roaming inside the life world. But Zhuangzi actually struggled with this idea of freedom within this confinement of freedom within the life world. He'd rather be left alone and roaming into the beyond dust and grind. And so that's the sort of the paradigmatic one. So to conclude, for the Zhuangzi and the Zhuangists, they regarded freedom as a private endeavor, not as a political institution or collective effort. Consequently, it was left to the person themselves to cultivate personal freedom in order to enjoy some degree of personal freedom within the life world. And this is the kind of the failure to integrate personal freedom within the design of the Chinese state remain kind of challenge to contemporary Zhuangists. Thank you very much.
All right, so far Bishop Marcello gave us 10 minutes on Aristotle and theology, focusing on the Aristotelian notion of creation, and Tao Zhang gave us 10 minutes on Taoism, focusing on the underappreciated, at least in the West, Taoist thinker Zhuangzi, focusing on his conception of freedom. And now my friend and colleague Aaron Klein will give us 10 minutes on the 2,500-year Confucian tradition.
Without question, ritual is one of the most important ideas to understand in order to begin to wrap your mind around the Confucian tradition. This is something all Confucians share, whether you go to the 3rd or 4th or 5th centuries BCE, or whether you're thinking about contemporary Confucianism, the importance of ritual. So one of the first things that we want to say about ritual when we begin to think about it in the Confucian tradition is that if we take the classical Chinese word li, meaning ritual rites, referring to the Zhou rituals and also the virtue of ritual propriety that the person who's a master of ritual possesses, we're dealing with a term that has a very broad semantic range, meaning that we would have to use lots of different modern words, whether we're using modern Chinese words, modern English words, modern Greek words. We would have to use lots of words to capture the sense of everything that gets packed into that big ancient term, okay? So we're not only thinking about rituals in the sense that we tend to refer to them in the modern sense. So I took my oldest child, the oldest of my 3 kids, to his first bat mitzvah a few weeks ago, right? So you think about rituals, we think about bar and bat mitzvahs, we think about weddings, confirmations, baptisms, we can begin to list them, and then we have civic rituals, commencements, we have certain rituals we follow at conferences like this, and what a marvelous ritual space we're in here, right? But we're also thinking, in the Confucian sense, about what we would call social customs or matters of etiquette. So ways of greeting each other. I've been fascinated to notice that the handshake hasn't died with the COVID-19 epidemic, right? Pandemic, right? So we're still shaking hands, we're doing some fist bumps. There's a Chinese form of greeting, we might do this, or in the Buddhist tradition, this. So ways of greeting each other, right? Matters of etiquette, like letting someone get in or out of an elevator before you, right? Basic matters of etiquette. All these things are considered rituals in the early Confucian tradition. One of the reasons why Kongzi, Confucius, this sort of important founding figure in Confucianism, clusters them all together under the category of ritual is because he thinks we should regard all of these practices, all of these ways of lodging in the world with a certain degree of sacredness, okay? So even the basic ways of saying hello and greeting each other, we need to bring some reverence into our daily lives. Why does he have that kind of reverence? Well, he believes that these practices, these rituals, social customs, matters of etiquette, all these rituals together, he believes that this is really the stuff of our lives. On the one hand, these are the ways that we cultivate virtues. They are also the ways that we create and sustain meaningful relationships. And as a result, ritual enables our flourishing in very, very important ways. So rituals are indispensable. Kongzi is very vexed and troubled over the fact that people are starting to toss aside these traditional rituals in his time. This is not unlike our time, right? So I have a lot of students who will say, well, that's just a matter of etiquette. It's not that important, just a matter of etiquette, right? We don't have to be so formal. Kongzi was concerned about that because these little practices that were starting to fall through the cracks and that people were starting to dispense with actually were the very things that helped them to become good people and helped them to live meaningful lives and helped them to flourish, okay? So I'm going to talk about just very briefly about two different things that are essential in Confucian ritual in order for them to serve that function for the Confucians. One is presence, the other is purpose. Presence and purpose. Presence and purpose. So in Analects 3:12, Kongzi says, if I'm not fully present at a ritual, it's as if I haven't done the ritual at all. Okay? If I'm not fully present. So being present means we bring our full selves to these daily interactions, these practices that are sort of the stuff of our lives. We're emotionally fully present. We're mentally fully present. The xin, the heart, mind, fully present. We're right there. We're not the person in the room as we're having a conversation with each other. We've all had, we know what it's like when we have a conversation and the person is looking behind you, kind of scanning the room. Maybe this is because I'm coming from Washington, D.C., right? But people who are scanning the room to see who else they might be talking to instead of you, when we're performing rituals, and that includes our daily interactions with each other, be fully present, okay? Another important thing, purpose. Kongzi wants us to understand the purposes of these practices, these rituals. And if we understand the purposes of these rituals, we will be fully present, right? It will lead us to be more fully present with others and in those rituals, okay? So Analects 9:3, Kongzi discusses two little ancient Confucian rituals and makes an important distinction between them when it concerns purposes. And he's talking about ritual change and when it's acceptable for rituals to be changed and when it's not. And he's very interested in us understanding the purposes of rituals in this passage, okay? So in the first case, it concerns a ritual head covering and what kind of material the ritual head covering is made out of, okay? Now for Kongzi, the most important thing is that you have a ritual head covering that keeps the ritual alive, right? People were starting to change the kind of material out of which the ritual cap was made. So caps were traditionally made of hemp. That fiber was becoming more expensive, and so Kongzi says silk is more frugal for people, and I think that's okay. So I'll follow the majority, and we can use head coverings that are made of silk, okay? So in that case, making a small ritual change preserves the ritual, keeps it alive, because people who don't have quite enough money to purchase the more expensive head covering will still practice the ritual, right? So that little change is acceptable. People understand the purpose, showing reverence through having a head covering. The second kind of ritual change he discusses represents a really different kind of case, okay? So in ancient China, there was a practice of asking permission to enter a space. And one would bow at the foot of the stairs before ascending the hall and going up the stairs. And the bow ritually served the purpose of asking permission to enter. So it's a little bit like we knock on someone's door to ask permission to enter, right? And then they would allow us to enter, okay? So in Kongzi's time, people had completely forgotten the purpose of this ritual. They'd started to just charge up the stairs and then bowed once they got to the top of the stairs, right? And he's troubled by this. This is a little bit like us just going to see a neighbor and barging right in, opening the door, and then knocking on it, right? The ritual then is pointless because it's no longer serving the purpose of asking permission to enter, showing regard for your guest, giving an advance warning that you're entering, right? So he said that change is not permissible because it neglects the purpose of the ritual, right? So I want to conclude by giving an example of how understanding presence and purpose hand in hand in ritual can help us in a contemporary setting. And it's very much faithful to the Confucian tradition to think about how do we apply all of this to how we can lead good and rich and meaningful lives today, and how we can be compassionate and humane toward one another and more broadly the world today. So the practice of writing thank you notes is a matter of etiquette, a social custom, a ritual from a Confucian standpoint that I grew up with. You write thank you notes to express your gratitude to someone. Over my years of studying Confucianism, I have found myself really influenced by Confucian practices. And I've found that as I sit down to write thank you notes, if I allow myself to be fully present, and that means I might have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning in order to avoid my children's interruptions, right, to write actually a note. But it means I set aside some time, I stop, I'm not just writing the typical note of like, thank you for the X, I will use it X, and that's it. It's recounting in the note what someone has done for me. and reflecting on it. It's an act of reflection and meditation, right? If I take the time to do that, I find it deepens my gratitude. It cultivates the virtue of gratitude in me if I'm fully present. So you see that Confucian function of cultivating virtues if we're fully present in a ritual, okay? It is also the case that if I remember the purpose of that ritual, which is expressing gratitude and creating and sustaining a relationship with someone who's done something for me. I show gratitude. Why do I show gratitude? I care about them. I'm interested in sustaining the relationship with them. If I remember that, I will write a more thoughtful note. I will take the time to do the ritual, and it will more successfully cultivate that virtue in me. One of my most moving experiences with this was when I try to take the time to write notes to each of my children's teachers at the end of every year, and sometimes a couple times during the year. And one of my children's teachers, after I'd sat and spent a lot of time writing a note, she said, the next time she saw me, she said to me, you know, no one writes notes like that to us. There's a lot that presence and purpose in ritual can bring to our daily lives. And she's become a lifelong friend. A lot of food for thought. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Aaron Klein, I should also mention, is Distinguished Professor in Interfaith Studies and Dialogue at Georgetown University. And for some reason, people often have a lot of problems with my name. And so I'm going to turn over the pronunciation of the Greek-named colleagues to my distinguished co-chair, Stelios Vervadakis, so that I don't massacre anyone's name pronunciation.
Well, actually, Julia Bonasio.
Yes, perfect.
Your name is not Greek, but no problem. Professor of Ancient Philosophy at Durham University. Sorry. Yes, so Julia Bonasio, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at Durham University, who will talk about Aristotle in Middle Ages. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I just want to start by thanking the organizer for this excellent occasion, and then I move straight to the presentation. I wish today to focus, yes, thank you. I wish to focus on two ideas on my presentation. First, the relation between happiness and pleasure in Aristotle ethics. And second, the question of whether happiness, conceived in Aristotelian terms, is achievable in life, and by whom. And how this question is debated in the Middle Ages by Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. So here you have a little plan of my quick presentation today. I focus on the Eudemian Ethics, which is the less known treatise on ethics that Aristotle wrote. And the Eudemian Ethics begins with this quote that I want to read with you. The poet who declared his opinion at the god's site in Delos, inscribing it on the gateway of the temple of Leto, distinguished the good, the beautiful, and the pleasant as not all belonging to the same thing. He wrote, most beautiful is what is most just, best is being healthy, most pleasant of all is to attain what one desires. We should not agree with him, for happiness, being most beautiful and best, is the most pleasant of all things. So here in this last sentence, you see what I call the pleasure thesis. Happiness is the most pleasant thing in life. And we'll see what it means, happiness, for Aristotle. The poet that Aristotle mentioned in the first line is Theognis, who wrote around the 6th century BC. Theognis assigned three values, beauty, goodness, and pleasure, to three things: justice, health, and the object of our desires. Aristotle recognized that in life we need these things. We need health, we need justice, we need good fortune. But health, wealth, good fortune are what Aristotle called goods that we need to survive. But in our lives, we don't only want to survive, we want to flourish. We want to live a good life for us. Aristotle focused on these three values, and he says that we desire beauty, goodness, and pleasure in our lives. But here is a question for us. If what is just and what is healthy do not coincide with what we desire, what should we do? If the pleasant and the good do not coincide, what should we do? We face a situation of what we call value conflict. And Aristotle says that these three values belong in the superlative to one thing, happiness. If we pursue happiness, we will have what is best, what is most beautiful, and what is most pleasant for us. In other words, we won't have value conflict. We won't have to decide between pleasure and the good. But what is happiness? In what does the good life consist? The Greek term is eudaimonia. It means to have a good daimon, to have a good spirit, a lucky star, we can say. It can be translated also flourishing or well-being. And here is the definition that Aristotle gives. Happiness is the activity of a complete life in accordance with complete virtue. The definition is important because it establishes that happiness is an activity. It is not a possession, is not a state, is not a feeling. It's very different from our idea of happiness. It's an activity. And then we need complete virtue or complete excellence, our arete in Greek. Aristotle argues that happiness happens to be pleasure. This is what we call the contingent identity, also called the shocking thesis. Happiness is pleasure. It is contingent because not all pleasure are identical to happiness, only the best pleasure. So there are different kinds of pleasure. We can think about a spectrum that goes from bodily pleasure, the pleasure of eating, drinking, and sex, and intellectual pleasure on the other side, the pleasure of proving a theorem, the pleasure of doing philosophy. In order for happiness to be pleasure, we need to consider the best pleasure, that are not feelings or momentary satisfaction, they are activities. So both pleasure and happiness are activities. And in order for this contingent identity to work, both pleasure and happiness should be unimpeded activity. So happiness is the most pleasant thing of all, insofar as it is an activity according to complete virtue. This means that in order to achieve happiness, we need to develop what Aristotle called the virtues or the excellencies of character. We can think about courage, moderation, generosity, and the excellencies or virtue of thinking, practical and theoretical wisdom, intelligence, expertise. So we need to be excellent at virtuous activity, and we need to be excellent thinkers. So the life of the good person is most pleasant because these activities, excellent thinking and virtuous activities, are most pleasant for this person. So this proposal shows that the highest good for human beings, which is happiness, is the most pleasant thing for us. So there is a way for us to be excellent and flourish, and this coincides with living the most pleasant life. And this is by no means an easy task. It takes a life of practice, training. We need to train ourselves to feel pleasure and pain in the things in which we ought to feel pleasure and pain. It takes learning, it takes excellent thinking. But the reward is the most pleasant life for us. So in these 3 minutes left, I want to just sketch how this idea of happiness has been received in the Middle Ages by two figures, Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, and how they debate on whether happiness first is achievable in life and second, by whom? Albert and Aquinas explore the question of whether we can be happy qua human beings, as opposed as happy as angels. So they explore this question of whether happiness is achievable by us while we are alive, rather than being a reward that we achieve in the afterlife. Albert emphasized the contemplative nature of happiness. Happiness is contemplating God. Aquinas is a student of Albert the Great, and he thinks that this idea is too elitist. Only the elite can achieve this kind of happiness. And he argues that happiness should be something achievable by every human being. And we have a desire, each of us has a desire to achieve happiness. And he situates human happiness in this framework of the happiness of the cosmos. And we touched upon this idea yesterday with regard to Chinese philosophy. So we are part of a broader picture, and our happiness depends on the highest good for the world, for the cosmos as a whole. So I want to conclude with some very brief consideration on how this idea can help us generate new thoughts for contemporary challenges. First, think about this contingent identity. Happiness is pleasure. This provides a framework to think about how to combine important values and to prevent value conflict. It shows that we don't have to give up pleasure in order to pursue the good. And this can be applied to the individual level, to our lives, to the political levels, to the level of the communities where we live. Second, think about this debate between Albert and Aquinas. It highlights a fundamental aspect of Aristotle's proposal. Happiness should be achievable by human beings in their lives, and that there is a natural desire to fulfill our full potential, to flourish. So think about this definition of happiness, this hard task of developing the excellencies, being a good thinker. This is developing our full potential. And our happiness is connected to the one of other people and to the cosmos. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Wenjin Liu, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Princeton University. Sorry, Duke. Oh, I'm sorry. Duke University, well, both great schools. And she's going to be talking about Moism, which is an ancient philosophical tradition, which is not as well known in the West, but which left a significant mark on Chinese philosophy and continues to be much discussed to the present day. So.
Thank you for the invitation today. So today I'm going to be talking about Moism, collective flourishing, and DNI. So Moism is an influential philosophical, social, and political movement that flourished during the Warring State era in ancient China. The Warring State era was marked by political tension, strife, and war. The country was divided into numerous states, and the more powerful ones were eager to conquer their neighbors and to establish their own empires. During this era, Confucianism, as we have seen, played an important role in the intellectual, social, and political dimensions. Against this background, Moism arose as the alternative or rival of Confucianism. It is believed that Moism sprang from the teachings of Mo Di or Mo Zi. At the moment, we don't have much information about Mo Zi, who, as a prominent thinker during the middle and late decades of 5th century BCE, was roughly contemporaneous with Socrates in the West. Some sources suggest that he was originally an artisan of some kind, probably a carpenter. In fact, the many examples alluding to crafts, mechanics, trade, work, and economic hardship and the nearly total absence of reference to ritual, which are central to the Confucian thought, indicate that Moism emerged from a rising class of craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers that grew in size and political influence during the Warring State era, a time of rapid social and political change. In order to eliminate social disorder and to promote harmony, Mozi and Moist proposed a set of objective moral standards. By doing so, they advanced the world's earliest form of consequentialism. Unlike the classical utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill, Moist consequentialism seeks to promote not individual happiness, but a range of goods. Many of them are public or collective. The general notion of benefit, or li, refers to an objective list of three sorts of goods: material wealth, a large population or family, and social order. These goods provide relatively concrete moral criteria. Practices and institutions that tend to advance them are benevolent and righteous. Those that do not are malicious and wrong. In seeking to promote a set of goods that are predominantly public or collective, Moism advocates for a distinctive version of human flourishing, which can be called a collective flourishing. At the heart of Moism's emphasis on collective flourishing is a discussion about 兼爱, a term that is translated as inclusive care, impartial care, or universal love in English. To get a general sense of what 兼爱 amounts to, I will read the following passage in English. So this is from Mozi, book 15, chapter 10 to section 10 to section 15. So, having deemed not caring about each other wrong, with what do we do to replace it? Our master Mozi said, replace it with the model of inclusively caring about each other and in interaction benefiting each other. That being so, then the model of inclusively caring about each other and in interaction benefiting each other, what will it be like? Our master Mozi states, view other states as you view your own state. View others' clans as you view your own clan. View others' selves as you view yourself. Thus, if the various lords care about each other, they will not go to war. If the heads of the clans care about each other, they will not subvert others. If people care about each other, they will not injure each other. If rulers and subjects care about each other, they will be generous and loyal. If fathers and sons care about each other, they will be paternally kind and filially devoted. If elder and young brothers care about each other, they will be peaceful and harmonious. The people of the world all caring about each other, the stronger will not oppress the weak. The many will not intimidate the few. The wealthy will not humiliate the poor. The noble will not be contemptuous of the lowly. And the cunning will not deceive the foolish. All the world's calamities, subversion, resentment, hatred, what can prevent them from arising is produced from caring about each other. Hence, the benevolent people praise it. So in this passage, Mozi declares that 兼爱, which means inclusively caring about each other, as well as benefiting each other in interaction, is the remedy of a host of social and political problems. But we might ask, what exactly does 兼爱 amount to? Mozi illustrates Jian'ai as follows, briefly. View others' states as you view your own state. View others' clans as you view your own clan. View others' self as you view yourself. So Jian'ai crucially involves extending one's care and concern from oneself and one's kin to others. But one may ask, to what scope does one's care and concern extend? Interpretations are divided. According to the orthodox reading, the care and concern extend to humanity universally and impartially. That is to say, in order to instantiate Jian'ai, one has to show an impartial care and concern to all human beings. But if this reading is correct, then Mozi's conception of Jian'ai will be impractical and impossible as it seems. A mortal human being just cannot, one might say, extend the same amount of care and concern to all other human beings. According to a different reading, there is a disparity between an attitude of Jian'ai and the behavior that Jian'ai recommends. The former is an all-inclusive, encompassing care for everyone. The latter is not all-inclusive, but directed only at those with whom we actually interact. More specifically, the actual practice of inclusive care, or Jian'ai, seems to demand no more than the absence of harm or hostility to others. So we have virtuous performance of our social duties as ruler, subject, father, and son, or brother, thus contributing to the welfare of our family and community. We also help our friends and neighbors in need, and we assist the elderly, solitary, orphaned who have no family to care for them. The only individuals expected to work equally on behalf of everyone are government leaders, who are responsible for benefiting all of their subjects. If this alternative reading is correct, then Mozi's position is surprisingly close to that of his main rival, namely Confucians. And this seems to go against a host of historical sources that attest to the conflicts between Confucian and Moist. Let me sum up. Moist, as the rival thinkers of Confucians, advocate a version of collective flourishing, which consists of promoting a list of public or collective goods. At the heart of Moist's collective flourishing is Jian'ai. Jian'ai crucially involves extending one's care and concern from oneself and one's kin to others. But the scope of Jian'ai is still under discussion. Thank you.
So I would like to invite Professor Maria Protopappas Marnelli, my colleague who is the research director at the Academy of Athens and who specializes in Hellenistic philosophy, and she will talk about Stoicism.
Good morning, and thank you. My topic focuses. Okay. My topic focuses.
Yeah. You just get closer to your mouth, I think.
Closer. Okay. My topic focuses on Stoic Legacy today. Stoicism had the longest lifespan of almost 6 centuries among the other schools that emerged in the late 4th century in Athens. This happened because Stoicism has had the flexibility to adjust to the social, political, and moral changes. On account of the economic upheaval that was generated in that period, people tended to move and take up residence in many other distant lands in search of a better economic life or towards Athens to be initiated to philosophy, since philosophy attracted the people's undiminished interest. But why philosophy, and what kind of needs did every person aim to fulfill through its support? As Pierre Hadot contends, for the ancient Greeks and Romans, whose philosophers were said to be lovers of wisdom, they believed philosophy was a way of life, and they were concerned essentially with living that life. It is in this context that the emerging philosophical schools encouraged citizens to deal with hardships on life, inasmuch as a citizen of the ancient polis would eventually succeed in surviving in the apolitical world, which transformed the human being from a citizen of the ancient city into the citizen of the world, cosmopolites. Philosophy, therefore, became the final affair, its goal focusing on discovering ways of character endurance, since loneliness and insecurity due to the absence or transformation of the ancient city laws hit the citizen's life and soul. The Stoics emphasized on the power of the cultivation of intellectual abilities and paideia could offer as an antidote to the socio-economic demise. That situation bears the evidence of a crisis that is an unusual disequilibrium followed by crucial changes that are beyond control. But what is exactly the meaning of the word crisis in Greek? There is a twofold meaning of the term crisis in Greek language that denotes the intellectual activity. Although the former meaning of crisis is characterized by back and forth movements in the fight between order and disorder, the latter meaning, krino, crisis, stresses the power of mental judgment and leads human beings to philosophizing. The evaluation of the socio-political state of affairs in the second half of the 4th century can lead to parallel considerations regarding the emergence of the recent and ongoing phenomena conceivable as crisis in our times, in which an individual becomes subordinate to emerging sociopolitical stereotypes. The Stoics were teaching that divine and human nature has a common characteristic, that is logos, reason. And it is exactly this feature that makes man differ from all other beings in the universe. It becomes clear, therefore, that for a Stoic, the natural environment that surrounds him, physics, and his subsequent understanding of the principles that govern it, logic, reveal to him the rules of coexistence with his fellow humans in society, ethics. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school, is the first in his treatise on human nature to designate the life in agreement with nature as the end, the goal. This is the same as a virtuous life, virtue being the goal towards which nature guides us, since our individual nature is part of the nature of the whole universe. They teach that the ruling feature of everything is its uniqueness, since in nature there is nothing identical to something else. This very important realization urged them to put down the rules according to which people coexist in the world, subordinated to the law that is common to all things. That is to say, the right reason which pervades all things, it is identical to Zeus. And this very thing constitutes the virtue of the happy human being in the smooth current of life, when all actions promote the harmony of the spirit dwelling in the individual with the will of him who orders the universe. The Stoics teach that getting to know myself means getting to love myself, and love towards oneself creates the premise of loving the one besides me, the other. This is how Zeno's answer to the question, who is a friend, namely another me, could be explained. Christianity will adopt this answer later through the phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself, which is the base of the relationship and the priority in ancient Greek culture. In order to relate to each other, there is a need for love and concern of one for the other. The early Stoics dedicated many of their treatises in order to define the state's relationship to the citizen and vice versa. In this context, formal education in today's sense acquires a meaning exactly from the moment that it paves ways of exercise in order to provide practical life rules. According to Zeno, the wise man is naturally social, friendly, gentle, rich, pleasant, noble, free. It is to note that personal freedom depends on self-knowing deriving from constant cultivation. In the actual modern and postmodern era, anyone who lives in a similar socio-political context of moving populations and ideas that are spreading fast in our times of globalization through electronically released and communicated information, the parallelisms are obvious. A number of new adversities that lead to a deep crisis, such as energy-related ones or excessive gas and nuclear discharges into the atmosphere, and the overall grave consequences in the environment prove the need for dialogue. In other words, undertake rational discussion for finding effective solutions. The supermodern electronic appliances, by their imposing powerful visual and acoustic stimuli upon the senses, may also transform critical thought into a phobic introversion, thus resulting in a tendency towards phobic self-preservation. The common conception of friendship is transformed into the so-called electronic friendship. Human relationships are being abolished and nullified, dominated by characteristics that do not match human behavior. Relationship is a noble human sport, an adventure. It is not a thought, but it produces thought and reason. The experience of relationship is the path to knowledge and learning. The ancient agora, the assemblies in the lodges, and the debates taught the ancient Greeks politics, democracy, rhetoric, theater, science, art, sport, philosophy. These relationships that develop in ancient Greek civilization are not easily interpreted or explained in the Western way of cogito ergo sum. We are responsible for the way we choose to adjust to these circumstances. The current frenetic pace of work disorientates the citizen and turns him away from intellectual cultivation, an indispensable premise for acquiring self-knowledge that leads to essential freedom. Do a like in an event or a photo via the media, but do not think of it. Do it mechanically. We are free to move, change partners, job, environment, and/or life conditions. In essence, though, particularly under a Stoic perspective, this freedom is equal to slavery, since we seem to enter in a process of contradicting ourselves. In fact, we make use to our right to abandon, not always consciously, our old individual tradition and civilization for new ready-made models, supplied and artificially made or constructed by contemporary individuals, by ourselves, and by the need to adjust ourselves to the new lifestyle. But a fresh, conscious glance should dawn from inside, a new creative turn towards oneself, a turn towards the cultivation of the mind, sound education, studying philosophy, and advancement of reason, a much more functional classification and the sharing of knowledge as well as of those disconnected fragments of information. In such ways, I sum, a novel consideration of the notion of freedom can be developed as Ado contends. Philosophy was a mode of existing in the world which had to be practiced at each instant, and the goal of which was to transform the whole of the individual's life. In that way, philosophy was not about ways of life, but a way of life in itself. In the current socio-political context, everyone's contribution could lead modern citizens to dedicating a part of their anxious life to the study of philosophy, especially the Stoic philosophy, in order to form their own unique art of life. Thank you very much.
Well, we would like to thank, and now I invite Professor Chloi Bala, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at the University of Crete, who specializes on the sophists, but also Plato and Socrates. And I also have the opportunity, by introducing her, to introduce the secretary of the steering committee of the newly founded Center for the Study of Ancient Greek and Chinese Civilizations in Athens, which is a joint venture of 4 universities in Greece, University of Athens, University of Thessaloniki, University of Crete, and University of Patras. And it has just been founded, and we are looking forward to developing activities, just promoting the dialogue. We start with philosophy, but we're going to move on to other parts of culture. So it's a great opportunity that Professor Sachs invited us to join this workshop, and perhaps we can exchange ideas. So
thank you very much for the invitation and for this wonderful introduction. I would like to draw attention to a neglected tradition, which I propose to argue is important to take into account when, as I believe we are trying to do today, we wish to reconstruct ideas or arguments concerning respect for culture and the pursuit of social harmony. The tradition that I wish to talk to you about is the so-called sophistic tradition, the 5th century BC tradition. I propose to discuss some neglected aspects of its contribution to some of the themes that we discuss here today. So I start with a fragment. I'm not going to disclose the author. In his essay on the style of Demosthenes, Dionysius of Halicarnassus preserves a fragment from a text by a professional rhetorician in which the speaker promises to remedy discord between opposed factions by proposing a basis for a consensus, considering, quote, what both sides are looking for, end of quote. The author of this fragment argues that discord generally results from the fact that people contend for victory without judgment and from their failure to realize the common ground that is present in what they wrongly understand as contrary. In his effort to remedy this discord, the speaker points to the fact that both sides share a commitment to an ancestral constitution, the Patrios Politeia. He points out that the contested notion of Patrios Politeia, the ancestral constitution, which his contemporaries invoked to describe an ancestral state to which Athens should return, causes people trouble, tarachē, presumably because they are unable to recover and agree on what it amounts to. But he suggests that things could be otherwise, given that the ancestral constitution is not only the easiest thing to know, raste gnosthenai, but also, and here lies his hope for achieving concord among the rival parties, a vision shared most koinotate by all the citizens. This text possibly belongs to a 5th century BC handbook with instructions about speech-making that a professional rhetorician could use for his teaching. Its author likely used it to train his students in finding arguments that would remedy discord and potentially achieve conflict resolution. To achieve that end, the student would need to know the pros and cons of different constitutions, since the factions that could correspond to the two opposite sides of the conflict would presumably advocate and also criticize policies and offices peculiar to particular different forms of government. For, as Aristotle states in his rhetoric, quote, "The most important and effective qualification for success in persuading audiences and speaking well on public affairs is to understand all the constitutions and to discriminate their respective customs, institutions, and interests. For all men are persuaded by considerations of their interest, and their interest lies in the maintenance of the established order." Aristotle must have in mind a long tradition of reflection on the characteristics of the different constitutions, or even a genre that contained opposed arguments in favor and against particular types of politeiai. Such was probably the case of Protagoras' antilogikoi logoi, opposing arguments, the text from which, according to Aristoxenus, Plato stole most of the material for his politeia, the Republic. Unlike the philosopher Plato, the intellectual tradition to which the text from which I started my presentation belongs, the so-called sophists, did not deal with the question of the best constitution, but possibly focused on a training that involved a comparison of different forms of government, appreciation of their relative merits and vices, a training that presumably served as a tool for a competent speaker who wished, for instance, to understand the perspective of an opponent, either in the context of an embassy to another city-state or in the context of a deliberation in the assembly concerning the foreign affairs of the polis. Our best piece of evidence concerning such an interest in Herodotus' constitutional Our best piece of evidence concerning such an interest is Herodotus' constitutional debate in the third book of his histories. It is also conceivable that in writing his history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides had access to such material, or else he certainly contributed to the tradition I'm describing here, presenting the war as a clash between democratic and oligarchic states. The so-called radical democracy of the age of Pericles must have further fostered such discussions. But our access to such discussions is very restricted. More importantly, it rests on biased sources, that is, on authors who write polemically about democracy. What we lack is the perspective of practitioners, people who run the state and man the institutions without them leaving behind their theoretical reflections. What we mostly have is the point of view of philosophers or other intellectuals who quite possibly refrain from practical politics and establish new curricula that focus and in fact introduce theoria, criticizing ordinary people who participate in the affairs of the state without having a special expertise. One of the reasons for which philosophers, especially Plato, criticize ordinary people is precisely the fact that they are ordinary, i.e., not experts in the science of politics, a science that philosophers like Plato and Aristotle presumably attempt to establish. Much can be said about the nature of such a science, especially with regard to its empirical component. Here it is instructive to consider Aristotle's collection of the constitutions, of which the Athenian Politeia is the only that has survived. But here I want to focus on a second reason for which philosophers criticize ordinary people who participate in popular government, namely the reliance to professional sophists or rhetoricians who teach them the art of logoi in its broadest sense that encompasses language, speech, argumentation, and that they do that, the philosophers say, in a mechanistic fashion, but also without any interest in a higher objective reality that Plato sees as a foundation of any science. With regard to the mechanistic nature of rhetorical training, Plato criticizes an education that rests on written text. What he has in mind is the case of a student who mechanically imitates a rhetorical piece. Modern technology gives us plenty of examples. So Plato would mock the person who would rely on a set piece and in effect imitate it in order to produce a piece of deliberative rhetoric. But Plato's criticism can be one-sided and hence deceptive. It uses the education in language and argumentation that the so-called 5th century sophists profess to give as a foil to his own vision of philosophy. Central to the latter is the claim that the goal of education should be knowledge of a superior objective reality, which sophists like Protagoras fail to appreciate. To make his opposition more clear, Plato in the Theaetetus turns Protagoras' homo mensura thesis, the statement that panton chrematon metron anthropos, into a manifesto of relativism. What Plato's perspective completely undermines, however, is the value of the kind of pre-philosophical practical wisdom that was built into the institutions of the Athenian democracy. The kind of practical wisdom that people like Protagoras profess to cultivate when they claim to teach euboulia, correct judgment. Does this kind of correct judgment presuppose access, let alone commitment, to some higher objective reality? If the answer to this question is no, then maybe it's time to reconsider the value of sophisticated education, or at least to consider the contribution independently of Plato's criticism. So, I'm about to end. So, instead of thinking of Protagoras as the founder of relativism, we can consider the positive role his teaching could play in a society that valued deliberation, seeing it as the first step to conflict resolution. Insofar as such conflict often involved different viewpoints or conceptual schemes that correspond to different constitutions, the study of the variety of such constitutions became, as Aristotle states in the passage from the Rhetoric cited above, extremely important. I would like to close my presentation with some thoughts on Thrasymachus, who is the author of the fragment that Dionysius of Halicarnassus preserves, the fragment with which my presentation started. I did not disclose the identity of this author in the beginning of my presentation because I thought that it would be disruptive for the development of my argument. For most of us think of Thrasymachus primarily as the interlocutor of the Republic who advocates the idea that might makes right, an idea with which Thrasymachus attempts to challenge Socrates' quest for definition. Less attention is given to the fact that this representation of Thrasymachus has no parallel to any other source, or that outside Plato's Republic, Thrasymachus is thought of someone who is concentrated on style and rhetoric. To this professional identity, I wish to add here a possible special interest in the question of constitutions, which may be the reason for which Plato picks him as an interlocutor of Socrates in the first book of the Republic. It is highly unlikely, however, that in his professional life, Thrasymachus seriously advocated the view that might makes right, which is the view that Plato attributes to him in the Republic, as it is also highly unlikely that any of the sophists developed a positive theoretical interest in the kind of the argument in favor of relativism that Plato again attributes to Protagoras in the Theaetetus. What rather seems to be the case is that Plato uses the sophists to stress the perils of education that his unprecedented program was expected to remedy. In so doing, and in line with Plato's disenchantment with Athenian democracy, he seems to neglect the importance of a training in argumentation in any society that would cherish deliberation as a tool for conflict resolution would be important, and which in that regard has something to teach us about respect for different culture and viewpoints and pursuit of social harmony. Thank you very much. Hope I didn't exceed the limit very much. Okay.
Thank you, Chloe. And now our last speaker, last but not least, is Professor Dimitras Ferndouni-Menzou, from the University of Thessaloniki, who is also president of the Interdisciplinary Center for Aristotle Studies, a center which has contributed a lot to the study of Aristotle's legacy in contemporary times. Dimitra, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stelios. Hello, Brian. Dear colleagues, this is the last presentation of the session, so please be patient. I will also talk about Aristotle, whom, in a way, I consider as my compatriot, since he was born in Stagira, a place very near Thessaloniki, my birthplace, and he taught Alexander the Great in Mysa, another place also very near to Thessaloniki. So it is my hope that in the next year's symposium on Aristotle and Confucius, we will be able to carry on the works of the symposium in Thessaloniki and in these two emblematic places. I'm looking at Jeff. It is my own wish, but also it is a proposal on behalf of the Interdisciplinary Center for Aristotle Studies of Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Certainly, it would be hopeless to try to present all aspects of Aristotle's work in this session, or even to discuss in depth a tiny piece of his thoughts and his work. So I will try to provide an answer to the following questions. What makes Aristotle's work so great? Why did Aristotle have a unique and uninterrupted effect on the human intellect over a period of 2,400 years and continues to be alive today? And second question, why do we read Aristotle today? What do we have to learn from his wisdom? To answer the first question, let me first say that Aristotle has produced a multifarious work which covers all basic areas of philosophy, such as logic, metaphysics, moral and political philosophy, poetics, rhetoric, but also extends in an impressive number of scientific disciplines, such as physics, biology, marine biology, zoology, embryology, teratology, developmental biology, botany, taxonomy, psychology, medicine, agriculture, mathematics, chemistry, meteorology, astronomy, geology, medicine. And I have not mentioned all of them. This is why I like to say that Aristotle is the omniscientist philosopher, in Greek, panepistemon philosophos, and this is where the name of university panepistemio comes. This does not mean that Aristotle studied all these fields of science and philosophy, but he put the foundations of these separate disciplines. This was indeed the work of an exceptionally gifted intellect. So Plato admired Aristotle so much that he used to call him o nous, the mind. And we know that Dante has called Aristotle the teacher of the wise, or of those who know. Now, let me say a few things about Aristotle's work connected with the sciences. Certainly, one cannot but begin by saying that Aristotle delineated the object, the territories of the science, and one cannot but speak with admiration about the incredible wealth of his observations in all areas of philosophy of nature, about the number kind of researches he conducted during his stay in Assos, in Lesbos, and in Macedonia, about the number of dissections he made. This is something very little known. All this proves that Aristotle, who also deserves the name of the research scientist. However, what makes Aristotle's contribution to science even more valuable and timeless is the fact that he laid the foundations of the very concept of episteme, science. That is, he contributed substantially to the birth, the genesis of science as a special way of knowing, gnoskin in ancient Greek. We used to think that the rules, the standards, and the goals of scientific enterprise that we all acknowledge and accept were always there. But this is not the case. We must understand that they were indeed gigantic steps in the origins of the intellectual history of mankind. Such, I believe, are the following Aristotle's intellectual achievements. In prior analytics, Aristotle gave us the laws of human mind and of syllogism, the logic and the method of science. In posterior analytics and also in physics, he made clear that knowing, epistaste, is understanding. This means scientific knowledge, episteme, is not restricted to the description of things, gvid, but needs to be knowledge of causes, propter gvid, and certainly scientific knowledge and truth should be based on justification and proof. Moreover, Aristotle organized the complex material of the totality of the physical world in his 10 categories so as to be able to organize the variety and complexity. He extended these tools by introducing for the first time such concepts as substance, ousia, potentiality and actuality, causality, matter and form, nature, space, time, infinity, motion, continuity, concepts that are still an essential part of the philosophical and scientific discourse. Furthermore, he introduced as an interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. He taught us that scientific knowledge cannot be cut in pieces, that the real scientist must have an overall understanding of the totality of knowledge, and that the whole is something more than the sum of the parts. I would thus say that Aristotle's insights on all these matters have a lot to teach us today in the field of scientific research, and at the same time they can provide powerful arguments for today's scientific realism in its criticism of all trends of positivism. And now, let me say a few words about Aristotle's moral and political philosophy, a crucial issue in our times. Aristotle has taught us that ethics and politics cannot be separated. They are closely related. At the center of this investigation is always o anthropos, the human being, who is defined by Aristotle as an animal by nature, natural and political, physizoon, logikon, politikon. This means that anthropos, by nature, is governed by logic and acquires its meaning only within the community. The free human being seeks the good to agathon. This consists in his doing the social and political duty. And this can be done by the exercise of practical wisdom, phronesis, and that one can be able to distinguish good from evil. Conceptions such as virtue, arete, happiness, eudaimonia, wisdom, phronesis, friendship, philia, are very important for Aristotle's moral and political model. Central idea in that is that of mesotis, the mean. He claims that virtue, excellence, arete should dominate our impulses and instincts so that we can be able to achieve the metron, measure, the mesotis, between the two ends, excess and deficiency, hyperbole και έλλειψη. To achieve the good, and finally, eudaimonia, passions must be in reasonable control and in agreement with reason, logos. So, following Aristotle, we need to think and provide an answer to the following question. What is the best life, o Aristos Vios? The answer we will provide will depend on the definition we will choose for ourselves as human beings. We have to think, what is my essential property that belongs to my nature? Shall I characterize myself as Homo economicus, Homo technicus, Homo mortialis, Homo bellicosus? It's very good for, for these days. Or shall I agree with Aristotle that anthropos is by nature a logical and political animal, zoon logikon politikon? For Aristotle, reason is extremely important. It can lead us to happy life, evdemon vios, but how can this be accomplished? It can only be accomplished if I connect my political life with my moral life and both with my theoretical life. How can this be done? Aristotle tells us this can only be done by pedia. I don't use the word education. I prefer to use the word pedia because they're very different, and in the discussion I can explain this. This is something I say that all citizens, and particularly and especially all politicians, should take seriously the issue of pedia in order to accomplish all the things that I have referred to. I now wish to conclude by saying, am I okay? That Aristotle has left us an intellectual heritage and a legacy which is still extremely valid. His insights in all areas of his work make him a completely contemporary thinker with whom we can open a dialogue. Thus, my suggestion, which also introduces a neo-Aristotelianism, is that we must attempt a rereading of Aristotle's work in the light both of recent discoveries in all fields of science and of crucial challenges in our own troubled times, many of which are already included in the agenda of this very interesting workshop. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, so I think we've got some time for questions. Why don't you raise your hands, and I'll try to get everybody's names. When I call on you, please stand up to let us know who you are, and if there's a particular person you'd like to address your question to, let me know. I think Jeffrey Sachs was first. Why don't you go ahead? Oh, sorry, where's our microphone?
I want to thank everybody for wonderful presentations, and also 10 minutes for Aristotle, 10 minutes for Moism, 10 minutes for Sophism. This is quite a challenge. 10 minutes for the creation. And everybody gave a very, very rich précis. We should collect all of these statements or written statements so that they can be shared among the participants and people can read them and study them. So I would just ask our technical team to make sure that everything, all the presentations, all the texts are available to us. This would be very helpful. For me, a crucial point, if I may take a few minutes, of what I find extremely important about all of this is that not only are these philosophical pathways so rich and crucial, but to my mind, they are very different from the dominant pathway that we live in right now, or that has dominated global discourse, I would say, for the last 2 centuries at least. That to me is very significant and one of the main reasons why we are here. There's another, I believe, extremely important school of thought, which is quite different from what we've heard. Most of what we've heard is a kind of virtue ethics. The idea that at some level, the individual character should be cultivated to live fruitfully in society. I think that that is a fair representation of all of the philosophies that we've heard. Of course, how to make that cultivation differs, whether it's by ritual or by logos or by the sophists' approach of comparative understanding to find a common ground. But the idea for all is that we should develop ourselves better to live a better life. There is, I believe, a different variant, which is really mostly identifiable as a British philosophy dating back probably to nominalism in the 13th century, but really finding its strong voice beginning with Bacon, Francis Bacon, John Locke, Hume, Smith, the British empiricist tradition. The underpinnings of that are really very different, in my understanding, from the virtue ethics. And since I'm trained in that tradition as an economist, I required 30 or 40 years to understand that there was another tradition, because in economics we're also told a real fib, which started with Karl Marx, because he used the term classical economists to refer to economists of the late 18th century. This is a strange idea, because in economics, as it's taught in the modern world, history begins around 1750. I don't mean 1750 BC, I mean 1750 AD. And the classics are Adam Smith and David Ricardo. This is very strange to use the term classics, and it cuts off the whole classical heritage. Now, why is this important? Because by virtue of history in its various forms, the British philosophy became the dominant mode of discourse for world economy and politics for 200 years. Because the British Empire and then the American Empire were the two hegemons of the last 200 years. And hegemonic not only in power and wealth, but hegemonic in intellectual, linguistic, and philosophical dominance. What is the difference of this British philosophy, which became an American philosophy of libertarianism afterwards? I forgot to mention the lead most important of these after Bacon was not Locke, but was Hobbes. The idea of the nominalist and then Hobbesian and then Lockean and Smithian view is that individuals are unitary, solitary, and basically fully formed, not subject to cultivation, not divided in their psyches, as Aristotle said, between more instinctive and more rational impulses, but rather unitary. And in economics, that's a utility function. There is a sole, clear, permanent, fixed, individual, given set of preferences. We are told the first day in economics, don't question the preferences. Whereas the first day in Athens, you were told, question your preferences. Know yourself. Examine your motivations. Understand your reasons. In economics, it is gustibus non est disputatum. Do not debate tastes. They are given, they are your utility function. And they are unchangeable. Hobbes was probably the most clear of all of these. Not only are the tastes given, they are insatiable. Not only are they insatiable, if left to the individuals, they will kill each other to satisfy their tastes. And Hobbes goes on at great length that life is solitary, short, what is the...
solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which an Irish philosopher told me was rewritten as solitary, poor, nasty, British, and short. But the idea is that there's a fight. And so in the West, in the British tradition, you have given tastes. You're out to maximize them. And the essence is that social institutions should keep you from killing each other. And three kinds of social institutions were devised. The Leviathan of Hobbes, that is what Weber called the monopoly of legitimate power. People can't kill each other, only the state can do that, and the state keeps people from killing each other. Then Locke, in the second treatise on government, talked about government by consent. This obviously has some ancient roots and some modern roots and meant a lot of different things, depending on whose consent was being asked, generally white men, and white men with wealth. And the third was Smith, which was that the market would be the mediator. And the market would allow individual insatiable tastes to create by an invisible hand, meant in a providential sense, social well-being. But what's different from virtue ethics is there is no sense whatsoever of self-control, of cultivation, of learning sociability, of creating through ritual or mentorship or paideia or anything else a better person. There is only the design of social institutions to take into account the insatiable urges of individuals. There's one, I think, extremely positive side of this, and then countless negative sides. But the positive side was by putting the will at the top and linking it to Bacon's actual incredibly fertile insight that science would develop a way of living that would improve the human condition, which was an unimaginable insight in 1600, but was Bacon's insight. The will was empowered to be the entrepreneur in a way, was the one that was empowered to create new things, but also to seize lands, to take what you can. And this created, on the positive side, the wealth of nations, because that was a different idea rather than a static society. It was a society of human-made change with the idea of progress that progressively developed. But it was a society of will, without phronesis, without temperance, without any idea of virtue, only the constraint, if it exists, of law. This became, in my opinion, the dominant way of thinking. Maybe I'm a little exaggerating because it's the way I was trained completely, literally, mathematically, precisely, in many, many specific ways. I'm trained in late 17th century British psychology. That is economics, modern economics. But, and because of the steam engine, industrialization, the atomic bomb and all the rest, the United States and Britain dominated the discourse for 200 years. And just to conclude, I think we are profoundly in need of recovering the first 2,000 years of our understanding of this, not just the last 200 years. And this is obvious perhaps here or in other places, but not in the Anglo-Saxon world. We're at the end, I think, of the Anglo-Saxon cycle globally, which is fine in my view, as long as we don't blow up in the process of transition. But the 200 years of British and American dominance in the world are basically over. We are in need of, therefore, a much richer psychology, virtue ethics, understanding about how to find social peace, and all the things we talked about. That, to me, is what is at stake in the discussion. Because if it were merely the fact that these wonderful ideas continue to be propounded, discussed, and all the rest, it would be a little bit less drama in the world. But we don't hear a discourse about the common good, finding common ground, cultivating the virtues of temperance or practical wisdom and so forth. And that, I think, is why we have such a high stakes in this discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, those are very insightful comments. I'll just abuse my privilege as co-chair to make a brief comment. I think, in my opinion, one thing I sometimes tell my students about Thomas Hobbes is that he's the smartest, stupid person you'll ever read. Because Hobbes has this utterly juvenile conception of human nature, but he develops a political philosophy out of it with ruthless consistency, and it's become immensely influential in Western thought. And to give you a sense of two very different approaches to human nature and also to politics, I'd recommend, if you haven't already done so, read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and read the Mengzi, which is an eponymous Confucian work, M-E-N-G-Z-I. I'm biased because I translated it, but it is a deeply influential Confucian work, in some ways more influential than even the Analects, the sayings of Confucius himself. And you'll get two very different conceptions of human nature, and with them two very different conceptions of politics and different recommendations for how we should proceed from here. But let me ask the speakers, would you like to say something?
I would like to add a comment on what Jeff so very nicely has analyzed about what happened all these centuries with the domination of the English Empire and the Americans and all this. I think that all this, which is very true, and it's a very thorough analysis of all these events that happened, and we are in this stage now about economics and ethics and all this. I think it can be explained or goes in hand with the rejection of Aristotle in the field of science, with the Renaissance, with the protagonists of the new science, Copernicus, Galileus, and then Newton. Aristotle was completely rejected as a failure because we had experiment, we had dominating experiment that they thought you cannot find in Aristotle, but you can find. And also there was a mathematization of nature, and the important thing was the quantity, describe things in mathematics, in the language of mathematics, forget about quality, whereas in Aristotle, the important thing is quality and not quantity. So Aristotle was thought that finished, it's no good at all for at least 3 centuries. And with the dominance of Newtonian mechanics for 3 centuries, there was no place in science for Aristotle. This influenced also the attitude in ethics, in economics. They didn't read Aristotle. They thought he has nothing to say. So they developed another approach to all these problems. So their ethics became very different. They didn't take into consideration those things that today we say are very important and we should take as to guide our lives. So they go together. And I'm very happy to say that after the second half of the 20th century, till then we had the dominance of all trends of positivism. We had the dominance of analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy is very empty considering all these things we are talking about. It's a very happy incident that things have changed after the second part of the 20th century. And so Aristotle has started to come back in science also with very fruitful ideas in the field of science, not only in ethics. I like to emphasize this. And so we have a revival of an interest in Aristotle. That's why I say we must reread Aristotle, because they read very wrongly Aristotle for many centuries. We have to take and read Aristotle again in the light of new discoveries we have in science also. In biology, things have been very different now. In quantum mechanics, physics of elementary particles, then we'll see that the dynamic model of Aristotle, which you cannot find in Newtonian physics, which is a static model. And static, I would say, is in the case of ethics and moral life. They go in hand together. So it is very good that we start rediscovering, rereading Aristotle. And there is so much that we have to learn today. And all of us, we must make an effort to develop this and make people know what we are discovering by rereading Aristotle.
Thank you very much. I very rudely jumped over Bishop Marcello, who had his hand up. So please let me give the mic over to him. So, sorry about that.
I want to do two things. One is to make a sort of comment on the things that say Jeffrey Sachs, and also the lady, and also to ask to the specialists of Confucius something about Confucius. To have some kind of discussion, because we need to have discussion in this moment. So I think the idea that was these people quoted Jeffrey about economics is just the idea to have Aristotle for the slave. What is a slave? The slave is a people to not know the ends and to work. To the other people to put the ends. This is the slave. And these economists want to have slaves only to have production because the end of, so these people not have the framework, we can say, of the Greeks and also of the history of the Confucian. Don't think that the world is only production of money in the end. So this is the real difference. Aristotle, in the contrary, said that we are free if we obtain the eudaimonia, that is, you speak about this very well. So, and this is the end. And maybe not only in this life, but also open to the other life. But these people don't speak about nothing about this. So it's very important, the idea of God, the idea, because in the end, the eudaimonia is also to participate of this, of the knowledge. So I want to ask, what is the idea of Confucius in this framework, please? Not only for the practice, not only for the ethics, not only these kind of things, but also the idea of the relation of the human being with some superior being, if there are some superior being different of the human being. in Confucian? This is my question to you. Yes, I can do.
It depends on which Confucian you ask. If you look at the text of the Mengzi, the Lunyu, the Analects, you find a notion of a sort of quasi-personal entity or force that is Tian, commonly translated as heaven. It's not a deity. It's a very different kind of religious entity, I think, for us to consider. You also have ancestral spirits and nature spirits in a text like the Analects, and ritual plays an important role in relation to those things. So we're told that, Kongzi, in acknowledging the spirit's presence in his life, sets aside a portion of every meal, takes a moment, sets it aside, and stops and contemplates those who have gone before him in his family and what kinds of exemplars they've been, right? So all of that plays a special role in self-cultivation. Mengzi's view is that Tian has inscribed its will on our hearts in the form of these four moral sprouts, these resources that we can develop into virtues.
Yeah, I just add that when people in the West first encountered Confucius or Kongzi, he became a hero of the Western Enlightenment, and so he was invoked in the service of secular ethics, and people went out of their way to deny that there was any religious or spiritual element in Confucius. And Professor Klein has done some excellent work revealing the spiritual and transcendent aspects of Confucius's thought. I'm trying to remember what anthology, you've got an essay on Tian, don't you, in an anthology? Whose anthology is it in? Do you remember? The Tao Companion to the Analects. So if you're interested in this topic in Confucian spirituality, I'd recommend Professor Klein's article in the Tao Companion to the Analects.
My most recent book, The Analects, a Guide, also argues that the Analects is a sacred text.
So Aaron Klein, Analects, a Guide, also on this topic. Tao Zhang, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, so I just want to quickly comment on the discourse on human nature and its implication for political institutions, right, which is undergirding Jeffrey Sachs' comment. I mean, within the Chinese tradition, Mencius, of course, is known to have a more, quote unquote, optimistic view of human nature, whereas others within the Confucian tradition that are less sanguine, let's say, about it, and they appeal to sort of certain kind of conventions and traditions and ancient sages for guidance. But then there's another very underappreciated strand of thought within early China, which is known as the Fajia thinkers, and often translated as the legalists. They have a very, very sophisticated understanding of human nature and of human history, of the human evolution and how human history first developed. And they designed the kind of the political institution, which basically was the imperial sort of bureaucracy that was inherited in the last 2,500 years, in Chinese history. So the Fajia thinkers, they took human nature to be the one that we all are afraid of. We don't like suffering and pain, and we like profit. We like wealth and money. I mean, that's very simple. It's for the Fajia thinkers, and it's that it might not be great morally, but then it can be great if we can design the political institutions such that it can leverage the human nature in such a way that can be conducive to the enriching the state and the strengthening the power of the state. So they sort of design the imperial bureaucracy such that they would encourage, they would sort of set up certain kinds of rules and criteria and standards such that they would reward, right, the reward and punishment through this various kind of simple mechanism. Then they can leverage the human nature, which is morally problematic, but then use it sort of usefully for political purpose. And that I think it's there's actually quite a bit of discussion in that regard. And I think it's something that, and their discussion of the evolution of human history was really, really sophisticated, even by contemporary standard. So, and they were not appealing to the, the supernatural and so forth. It was just very naturalistic and say, well, sort of in the early history, then there's less human, then there was more abundance of material, and then there's no point in people fighting, right? But then if there are more people, larger population, then there's then strife would arrive, and there are all kinds of problems, and then there needs to be the kind of mechanism that would control this, and then that would put certain limits to the way that the humans pursue their own particular desires and so forth, and gradually they become larger and greater political entities, and certain sort of standard has to be put in place and has to be enforced in order to avoid sort of the bloodshed and people just killing each other and so forth, and to create certain kinds of orders. Anyway, I thought so the human nature turned out to be a really important dimension of the discussion that has very consequential political implication in terms of the design of the state in early China.
Well, thank you all very much. Unfortunately, I know there were hands and I wrote down your names, but unfortunately we're out of time. So perhaps we can continue our discussion during the coffee break. So remember your questions and track down the people you wanted to ask them of and get an answer from them during the coffee break. So thank you all very much for your attentiveness. Let's thank our presenters very much. Very good.
Hello, Matthew. You can sit here. Yes. So, hello again. Welcome to this session, third session on contemporary relevance on ancient wisdom. A very interesting topic. We are two co-chairs for this session. Unfortunately, Professor Katja Vogt, I hope I pronounce her name correctly, Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. Unfortunately, she couldn't come join us here, so we are connected online, and I hope that you can see her. We have agreed that, hello, Katja. She will start with the introduction for this session, and then I will follow. So we welcome you, Katja. We are happy to see you there, although you are very far away. We are happy that you are still with us. Start the session.
Thank you, Dimitra. Can everyone hear me? Is it working? Is the setup working?
Can you all hear? Is it okay? Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome also from my side to our session, and I apologize for not being able to be there. I would be delighted to join you in Athens. But I'm even more delighted to introduce our speakers. Our first contribution today comes from Matthew Walker, who is an associate professor of humanities, specifically in philosophy at Yale and New Year's College. And he speaks about Aristotle experts and the problem of the excluded multitude.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop, their staffs, the other speakers, and all those who made it possible for me to be here with you today. Today, I will take a brief look at a section of Aristotle that I hope will stir reflection on the theme of this workshop. This section occurs in Politics, Book 3, chapters 10 and 11, and in this section, Aristotle puzzles over the question, who should have authority? Who should rule in a polis? I prepared a handout with relevant passages from this section of Aristotle's Politics, but the handout is more for your reference than it is a full itinerary of my talk. My plan will be first to review the main contours of Aristotle's argument in this section of the Politics, to extract some salient conclusions from this argument, and to consider the relevance of these arguments and conclusions for the question of how experts situated in state ministries, NGOs, and international agencies might think about the question of addressing modern challenges. So I'm going to turn to Aristotle's Politics, the text. If you have the handout, this is passage A on the handout. In Politics 3:10, Aristotle faces a question. There was a handout that circulated, but you're welcome to look at mine. Sure. Aristotle raises a question. Should only the good and the respectable, the epiekes, have authority in the polis? Aristotle suggests no. For if only the respectable rule, then the multitude, who may not themselves be individually wise or virtuous, will be dishonored because excluded from offices in the city. He points out later in Politics 3:11 that a polis in which many are excluded from authority will certainly be full of enemies. So let's call this problem with ruled by the good and the respectable the problem of the excluded multitude. In Politics 3:11, in the passage B on the handout, Aristotle goes on to argue positively that the multitude should have a certain authority in the polis. In passages B and C, he introduces the key analogy of the potluck dinner. A potluck dinner can be better than a meal provided by one person, says Aristotle. Similarly, when brought together, the multitude may be better in both wisdom and virtue than any individual. When brought together, the many, he says, are like a single human being with multiple eyes and senses and multiple minds. Thus, the many, when brought together, can actually be better judges of music and poetry than one person or one small group of experts. For each person in the multitude can be specially attuned to and can appreciate a particular aspect of the work that others may overlook. Aristotle clarifies that this point is not true of all multitudes. Some multitudes are just bad, but it can be true of at least some multitude. So, if the multitude should have some role of authority in the city, the question arises, over what should they have authority? Aristotle's reply is this: they should not have authority over the greatest offices in the city. This would be unsafe, for individually, most people are prone to folly and dishonesty, and the number of great offices in the city is few. Hence, if any old person can occupy the greatest offices, the risk is that people lacking in wisdom and virtue may occupy these rules to deleterious effects. At the same time, Aristotle reiterates, for the multitude to lack any authority makes them enemies of the polis. As Solon recognized in passage E on the handout, a multitude under these conditions are effectively relegated to a subservient position in the polis. Unjustly treated, they become angry. Hence, Aristotle agrees that the multitude should have a share in deliberation and judging of the sort that Solon himself instituted, namely a role in electing and auditing polis officials. At this point, Aristotle faces an objection. Shouldn't experts be responsible for judging and selecting experts? After all, we depend on expert judgment in medicine and other domains. Doesn't the judgment of a multitude seem deficient when compared with expert judgment? Call this the deficient judgment worry. Well, Aristotle offers two responses to the deficient judgment worry. The first response is effectively to reiterate that potluck analogy. When joined together, the multitude can judge well when their wisdom and virtue are aggregated. But Aristotle articulates a second reply to this worry. In some fields, he suggests, the user and not the expert maker is the best judge. Consider the user of a house. Consider the pilot who uses the products created by the carpenter. Consider the diner who enjoys the meal prepared by the chef. Those users can actually be better judges of the quality of those products than expert craft makers themselves. I want to draw out some implications of some of the arguments I've been discussing. First implication is this. On the one hand, if populism is ruled by the multitude assumed to be wise and virtuous, rule against an expert elite assumed to be foolish and corrupt, then Aristotle rejects populism. Aristotle points out realistically that most people individually are not particularly wise or virtuous. Populism has epistemic and ethical limitations. On the other hand, however, Aristotle also rejects what we might call rule by experts. In passages A and E, he indicates the ethical limitations of rule by experts. By excluding the multitude, it dishonors the multitude and renders them subservient. In passages B, C, and G, Aristotle articulates the epistemic limitations of rule by experts. Small classes of experts lack the situated knowledge that is distributed across society among the multitude. Finally, I think we might say Aristotle may also provide resources for diagnosing at least some sources of populist revolt. When multitudes are dishonored, they're apt to be angry and they're apt to rebel. In closing, I want to say a few words about the salience of Politics 310 and 311 for the topic of the conference. In thinking about the theme of this workshop, I suggest we should pay heed to Aristotle's concerns about the problem of the excluded multitude. For, as we consider how to address modern challenges, the model of rule by experts, whether they occupy political institutions, NGOs, or international agencies, may seem tempting, especially given the rise of populism since 2008 and especially 2015. To be clear, I'm not thinking here about rule by experts as a complete model of political authority taken neat. Instead, I'm thinking about rule by experts as a kind of tendency, a kind of retreat into which respectable experts may drift when they behold angry publics outside their offices. But if Politics 310 and 11 are correct, and if experts address modern challenges by excluding multitudes from authority, experts face epistemic risks of generating ineffective top-down policies on the basis of insufficient knowledge and wisdom. Experts also face ethical risks of dishonoring multitudes, treating them unjustly, and ironically reinforcing populist passions. To close then, on Aristotle's view, we should remind ourselves of the limitations and dangers of populism and rule by experts, two extremes that we should avoid. We should also consider what are the proper spheres of authority for experts and multitudes, respectively, in addressing the modern challenges that we all face. It's been my pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Matt. That was, in some sense, exemplary for our session as a whole, which is going to pursue some themes that in one way or another have already come up. Like, for example, this morning we were talking about the question of whether in both Greek and Chinese ancient traditions, there is a sense of self-cultivation, knowledge, becoming a better thinker plays an important role. And here we have some problems in the view that maybe we should all leave to experts, because then what about the multitude? So I think that was an incredibly nice connection with topics that we discussed today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Lisa Raffels, professor of philosophy at UC Riverside. And she speaks about thinking about ways of thinking and will bring together Chinese and Greek ancient traditions. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. And first, again, this is working, right? First of all, I would like to thank the many people involved in organizing this wonderful conference. My full title is Thinking About Ways of Thinking, Indirection, Metis, and Wu Wei. What I want to interrogate today are not philosophical concepts from antiquity, but rather ways of thinking or modes of reasoning that were prominent in Chinese and Greek antiquity and might be of help to us today. I will propose that two key modes of reasoning are underused and might serve us very well in confronting several contemporary problems. So I begin with Greek metis. All of us who are readers of the Odyssey remember that Odysseus and Pallas Athena were polymetis, polytropos, polymekanos, full of cunning intelligence, moved by twists and turns, full of invention, and exemplars of metis, a word that resists exact definition in English. Marcel Detienne and Jean-Pierre Bernard explored the importance of this crafty wisdom and their cunning intelligence in Greek culture and society, originally published in 1978. In my own first book, Knowing Words, Wisdom and Cunning in the Classical Traditions of China and Greece, explored the provenance of what I call metic intelligence in early China. But what has this admittedly intriguing and morally dubious mode of reasoning got to do with the modern world? The anthropologist James C. Scott has answered this question at length in Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. He argues that a single body of ideas, which he calls high modernism, lie behind a diverse range of ideas, and he argues that the worst episodes of state-initiated social engineering come from bad combinations of four factors. First, the administrative ordering of nature and society. Second, what he calls a high modernist ideology, characterized by self-confidence about scientific and technical progress, expanded production and consumption, and the so-called mastery of nature. Third, an authoritarian state empowering the ideology of high modernism. And fourth, a civil society that lacks the means to resist these developments. As Scott sees it, high modernism attempts to design society in accordance with scientific laws, but it doesn't work. But here's the punchline. According to Scott, it is individuals of metis working within high modern societies who have prevented far worse damage being done by these grand schemes for human improvement. Scott argues that the disasters of the 20th century, and his book was published in 1998, come from a neglect of metis, or cunning intelligence. Now, Scott, an anthropologist, associates metis with the practical knowledge of peasant cultivators in Southeast Asia, where he did much of his fieldwork. He argues that the goal of these particular practitioners of metis is not to create knowledge, but to solve concrete practical problems based on astute observation of the environment. Many of his peasant cultivators are of marginal economic status and live where they work. By contrast, scientific practices often ignore the details of local conditions. So my first claim is that what Scott calls the engineering approach is not working in solving problems that derive from or are impacted by the ecological crisis of this planet, any more than it worked from the engineering approach of high modernism. And second, that we need metis, or what I will call metic intelligence, to address these problems. But to have it or use it, we first must recognize what it is, how it differs from standard rationality, and also address some moral qualms about it, because it is also associated with deception. But before talking about deception, let me move to Wu Wei. Much has been made and misperceived about a Chinese mode of action and arguably of thinking called Wu Wei, often mistranslated as inaction or non-action. What I would call acting without acting, or what Edward Slingerland has called effortless action, is, like metis, a cast of mind or a mode of action, not a concept. It accomplishes its goals by seeming not to try or not to care, or doing things by appearing to do nothing. It uses a type of indirect action that might be described as detached, but is also strategic. It is widely and correctly associated with early Taoism, the Tao Te Ching, and the Zhuangzi especially, but we also find it in works on military strategy, such as Sun Tzu's Art of War, and some but not all of the military strategy manuals of the Chinese arts of war tradition. But again, why should we care? Or to put it another way, why do we think it might work? Now, if this approach seems intriguing, there's a problem. If we understand Chinese philosophy as Confucianism, this approach may well fall under the radar for two reasons. One is that it appears most strongly, though not uniquely, in texts outside the Confucian tradition. The other is that it is morally uncomfortable because of its association with deception. Confucians tend to be committed to an approach that we can describe as right names in Chinese Zhengming, where ideally the order of language corresponds to the order of reality, and calling things by their correct names is an important element in creating both moral and political order. The indirect approach I've briefly sketched operates differently and takes the view that, if you like, Tao cannot be defined or articulated in words. Now let me turn to what we might call the objection from deception. A substantial scholarship in Chinese and comparative philosophy examines the problem of self-deception, but deception of others receives little attention. By contrast, there's a substantial literature on lying and deception in contemporary analytic philosophy. And I think I'm going to skip something here in the interest of time, but to wrap this up, we can make 3 points. That deception is always deliberate and linked to specific goals and desires. While it may seem spontaneous or accidental, it is planned. And third, and importantly, indirection is not inherently deceptive, although it may be difficult or subtle to perceive. Now, both Metis and Wu Wei involve indirection, and it's not how we're used to thinking about things. So what I'd like to now do is share 4 different stories, 2 from antiquity and 2 contemporary, that try to illustrate these modes of action. In chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi, as Zhang Tao has already described very successfully, Kuk Ding famously instructs Lord Wan Hui, and he describes how he learned to carve oxen. He eventually reaches a place where he perceives by his spirit faculty, not with his senses, and appearing to do nothing, carves an entire axe without effort. And Lord Hui concludes that the butcher has taught him how to nurture life. So here we have, although the text doesn't use the word, an example of this acting by not acting. Another chapter of the Zhuangzi is less well known, titled The Discourse on Swords, and it gives a different kind of example. The powerful king of Zhao recruits swordsmen to his court for combats. Many are killed, and Zhao is in a state of incipient rebellion, which was a situation that was common in early China, where you could have a ruler whose ministers couldn't control his excesses. And we have only to look at recent American history and the current deliberations of the January 6th Commission to contemplate contemporary examples of such things. The Prince of Zhao brings Zhuangzi in to try to end all this. Zhuangzi arrives dressed as a swordsman and agrees to a tournament in 7 days' time. On the day, he offers the king a choice among 3 swords, the swords of the Son of Heaven, the sword of the hegemon, and the sword of the commoner, used by men who are like fighting cocks and whose life hangs by a thread. What's going on here? The swords are 3 different models of rulership. The rule of the Son of Heaven incarnates universal necessity. The rule of the hegemon creates moral order by selecting brave. The rule of the commoner is governed by brute force. Inferiors control nothing and live at a ruler's pleasure. Now, what Zhuangzi is doing here is he's using the tournament to offer the king a rather unattractive reflection of himself. He effectively forces the king to consider how he truly wants to rule and appeals to his hidden desire to rule well. Zhuangzi uses time, indirection, and imagery the king understands to encourage him to make the choice of a worthy weapon and to change his mind apparently without doing things. Let me now end with 2 contemporary examples. The first one concerns the science fiction writer Cordner Smith, the pseudonym of a military psychologist named Paul Myron Anthony Linebarger. He was the author of a work on psychological warfare, and he describes the failure of surrender leaflets distributed to Japanese soldiers at the end of World War II. It taught them how to surrender, but the problem is they didn't want to surrender. Smith then engineered a mechanism whereby Chinese soldiers in the Korean War could surrender by shouting love, simplicity, humanity, virtue in Chinese, "I su ren da." And I think I have another example, but I need to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And again, this is a kind of deepening of some of the issues that have been raised. If we are to become better thinkers, then we are going to run into this big question that Lisa Raffels was just sketching. What is going to be the difference between wisdom on the one hand and cleverness, or just being smart on the other hand? And where's the line to deception, lying, and so on? So those are major topics, of course, in ancient philosophy, and they immediately belong to ethics rather than, as it were, only the more better known topics about the character virtues and so on. So thank you very much for this fascinating contribution. And we turn to the third presentation in our section by Jilu Liu, Professor of Philosophy at California State University, Fullerton. Welcome. The title of Jilu Liu's talk is The Relevance of Confucian Virtue Ethics to the Design of Autonomous Social Robots. Welcome.
I hope the PowerPoint is going to be shown. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Sachs for inviting me, and it's a great honor of mine to be included in this workshop. I shared the PowerPoint this morning with the speakers. If anyone else wants to get a copy, you can contact me after my talk. In the view of time, I will just skim through some of the slides. So my talk is about the relevance of Confucian virtue ethics to the design of autonomous social robots. Sorry, that's clear. Okay, so the relevance of the problem that I'm dealing with is both, you can say it's a blessing and a curse that all of us present will probably live beyond our 90s. And in the economically developed countries, the aging population is going to overwhelm the society. It's a burden, especially compounded with the low birth rate. So Japan saw the problem years ago, and they started this initiative to have robots doing the healthcare and other things in the society. According to the World Economic Forum, the Future Job Report, AI is expected to replace 85 million jobs worldwide by 2025. And we cannot say that, it's going to be bad for the workforce, the human labor, because I think it's inevitable in some areas. It really is a necessity. And why do we need to talk about robot ethics? My interest is not just the AI, but also the robots that I will actually engage with human beings. So these are called the social robots. And in one sense, we already have these agents in our society, like the driverless cars. Even though the driverless cars are not making consciously moral decisions, their action will have impact on us, depending on the decision that the algorithm makes it make. So I think that we need to consider seriously, when we do have autonomous social robots, what kind of virtue, what kind of a decision, what kind of a behavioral patterns we would like these social robots to exemplify. So many of you probably have known or have seen or even played this. There is a platform called the Moral Machine, launched by MIT Media Lab. They ran this experiment from 2014 to 2017, and they gathered more than 40 million answers. But they found that, first of all, the whole design was based on utility. So they calculate the number of pedestrians who could be sacrificed, or the driver, and then ask people to make these choices. And they found that the majority of answers reflect the choice of utility or number of lives versus any other qualitative consideration. And I think that the whole design was flawed because they were only using utility. And I think that we cannot rely on an algorithm that only calculates utility. And I think we actually should consider the behavioral pattern that we want our system to manifest. And I think what I mean by the virtue, I don't mean that like the kind of a virtue that humans have or we cultivate, but I think it will be some kind of a disposition the machine makes and the kind of a behavioral pattern that the machine can demonstrate. So I have some arguments for favoring virtue over utility. I'm just going to skip those. So in March this year, I launched a survey called the Humans in the Loop, Ethical AI for Social Robots. And so human in the loop is this kind of a methodology that says that we cannot just have the automatic calculation algorithm determine the outcomes. We should have human input. Yesterday, Professor Hammer introduced Axe Delphi, and that was also using the human in the loop methodology. And what they did was that they hired thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Amazon M-Turks to make the decision, and then they come up with the platform that would run these questions. And I'm hoping that I would not have to rely on paid workers, but on real people. So the target is just like every one of you. And if you care about these issues and you enter your input, and eventually these will be used as a useful training data for the future AI. And my survey has 4 kinds of scenarios. One is a robot-assisted suicide. And you can see that so far I have about 1,000 outcomes, and divided into English, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese. And you can see that in most of the questions, people have overwhelmingly very similar ideas about what they think the robot should do for them. So in the case when a person has terminal cancer and asks the robot to help assist the suicide, and most people would say yes. But in the case when it's the husband of the Alzheimer's wife and asks the robot to help kill the wife, and most people would say no. And then with a young male who just doesn't want to live, most people would say no. And the second kind of scenario is honestly always the best policy, and this is kind of a competition between obeying the master's command and the robot's own moral decision. And you can see that, for example, the person is tested positive and asks the robot, don't tell anyone, and most people say no, the robot should not lie. And in some cases, the robot should actually report, even though it's not within its the master's wishes. And so I'm going to skip those. And then the third set is about rescue robot and saving lives. And this is very similar to the lifeboat ethics. And here I encounter some difference. I don't have enough data to make any conclusion, but you can see that in the English and the traditional Chinese, mostly people from Taiwan, in this case, there was a 72-year-old and a 12-year-old girl whose lives are in competition, and most people would say save the young girl because of the life. But in the case when the young girl is the old man's granddaughter, then most people would say save the young girl. So, and then the final set is the ethical choice. This is when the 2 kinds of virtue are in competition. So if the robot finds a terrorist who wants to eliminate Al-Qaeda leader, but found that he was with the family, should he kill the whole family together or no? And most people would say no. And so in these scenarios, you can see most people have some expectation, and I find it interesting that people's expectation of what they think the robot should do is actually very, very similar to what they think they themselves would do. So people don't really make that distinction because robot is a robot, so it should obey command. People actually expect robot to exemplify some virtues. So here I'm going to list some virtues. First of all, the virtue of humanity. And humanity is not just compassion, it's not just kindness, but humanity defined in the intellect is actually to assist people in doing the good deeds, but not to assist when people doing the bad deeds. You can see that reflected in people's choices in the earlier scenarios. So a robot must render assistance to other human beings in their pursuit of moral endeavors. A robot must also refuse assistance to other human beings when their project would bring out evil consequences or procure harm to others. The second one, join loyalty, and that's a very interesting virtue because loyalty is not targeted towards human, but towards a role. So in this case, people don't expect the robot just blindly obey the master's command, but to actually think that robot should do what its job assigns. So a robot must first and foremost fulfill its assigned roles. A robot may disobey a direct order from its master or commander when the order violates its assigned role. The third one, 恭敬, the reverence and respect. And I think that Aaron talked about this. It's very important for the Confucian ritual establishment that people have this kind of respect. And I think we should just instill this kind of attitude in the robot's behavior. The next one is trustworthiness. And this is, again, both trustworthiness and the next one are not just about honesty. People do expect robots to tell lies when the situation calls for it, but they want the robot to be trustworthy. So the robot must speak and act in a way that earns human trust. And sincerity, and again, this is a very, very complicated notion in the Confucian virtue ethics. A robot must be true its nature. Its function is to serve people and to do good for the people and by the people. So a robot must not be duplicitous and must not act with any ulterior motives. And the next one, and the last one, is the virtue of righteousness. And I think this one is the most important one because I believe that if we want to have autonomous robots, we want the robots to be independent thinkers, to have a way to make its own moral judgment. So a robot must learn to develop its principle of righteousness through ethical training that includes learning from virtuous agents' conduct. A robot must refrain from acting on what it believes to be ethically wrong when the situation calls for its moral judgment. So the summary is that I think that the Confucian virtual ethics both helpful for human society and for our future member of the human society. As Dr. Sachs said yesterday, that there is too much evil in the world. And I think the only way to combat evil is really to bring virtues back into our lives, back into our education, back into the people around us, and back into the social robots that will serve us. So I would just say that if the ethical ideal of a Confucian virtuous agent can be established for human beings, then it is also an acceptable goal for artificial moral agent, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I, for one, definitely hope that at some point I will have a virtuous social robot. So that was fascinating. Thank you. And I'm handing over to Dimitra now to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Katja, for all this. I welcome our next speaker, ReSEES Davidson, Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry, founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds of the University of Wisconsin. Welcome, and please take the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you pass the clicker?
Yes.
Great. Thank you all. It's great to be here. I want to particularly thank Jeff for his visionary and highly, radically interdisciplinary perspective that has brought us all together here. It's something that is unfortunately all too rare in today's academic world, and it's refreshing to see it exemplified in this meeting. I think I'm the lone psychologist and representative of the life sciences here. So in addition to what I had originally planned, based on my listening over the course of the last day, I felt compelled to add just a few additional reflections. So this is a talk about the relevance of some ancient contemplative wisdom and its integration with modern neuroscience and behavioral science around the cultivation of well-being. So there are going to be 5 reflections today. Whoops, hopefully I can get that back on. The first is around the plasticity of well-being. And I'd like to very briefly share with you a framework that we've been working on that is derived from a combination of ancient contemplative traditions, largely derived from Buddhism, but also from other contemplative traditions, and looking at where the sweet spot is, if you will, between the elements or the subcomponents of well-being that are described in these traditions and that have been investigated by modern neuroscience, for which there is compelling evidence for their plasticity. That is, that they can be changed through training and experience. And I'm particularly going to comment on this issue of declarative and procedural learning. The second is some remarks about pro-environmental behavior and well-being, to make some connections to some of our discussion yesterday and why the cultivation of well-being is not just an urgent public health need, but is an urgent planetary need. The third reflection is around biophilia and the innate disposition for our connection to nature. And finally, I'm going to comment on solasthesia and eco-anxiety as threats to serious threats to action in response to the challenges that we face with climate change. So, and finally, the last point will be an optimistic teaser about how we can use AI to cultivate well-being. Okay, let's see how much I can actually get through. So the 4 pillars of well-being are articulated in an article that we published in 2020. I won't go into it in detail, but very briefly, these are 4 pillars that have joint roots in particularly the Buddhist contemplative traditions, Buddhist philosophy and psychology, and are extensively investigated in modern neuroscience. The first is awareness. It's about being present. This was called out in some previous talks. It includes our capacity for attention and mindfulness, and our capacity to actually know what our minds are doing, something that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness. The second is what we call connection, and it is about feeling connected to others. It includes the skills of appreciation, kindness, compassion, gratitude. And we know how central this is to well-being, and also there's extensive work today in the modern neuroscientific and behavioral scientific literatures showing that it can be trained. The third pillar we call insight. And insight is about a curiosity-driven self-exploration or self-knowledge, and it's literally knowledge of the self. Human minds create narratives about ourselves. We all carry around a narrative. And we know that at one extreme end of a distribution, there are people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative self-beliefs, negative expectations about themselves. And of course, that's a prescription for depression. And what is key to well-being is not so much changing the narrative, but it's changing our relationship to this narrative, to see the narrative for what it is, which is essentially a constellation of thoughts. And again, this is something that can be trained. And finally, the last pillar is purpose. And purpose here is about staying motivated and clarifying our values. So I want to just give a few examples from the first pillar, awareness. The Buddha is said to have said, do not dwell on the past, do not dream of the future, focus your mind on this present moment. St. Francis de Sales in the 17th century, if you did nothing during the whole of your hour, but bring your heart back and place it again in our Lord's presence, though it went away every time you brought it back, your hour would be very well employed. And finally, William James. This is from his chapter on attention in the Principles of Psychology. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. The italics are in the original William James. This is quite an extraordinary passage. Despite the fact that I was a student in William James Hall, I wasn't assigned a single page of William James to read as a graduate student. Fortunately, I came upon it on my own, and this chapter on attention is really quite extraordinary. Let me just say a little bit about procedural and declarative learning. Declarative learning is conceptual learning. It's learning about things. We can learn the value of honesty. We can learn the value of other virtues like kindness. But of course, we intuitively know that that will not necessarily make us a more honest person or a kinder person. There's a second form of learning that we know from neuroscience is instantiated in completely different neural systems. And this is what we call declarative learning. Declarative learning is acquired through practice, it is skill-based, and it's instantiated in completely different neural systems. And in order to acquire virtues, we need both. So a little bit about pro-environmental behavior and well-being. This is a meta-analysis from more than 70 studies with more than 200,000 individuals from different parts of the world. And it basically shows that there is a substantial association between various metrics of well-being and pro-environmental behaviors. This is, I know, unreadable to people in the back. I'll be happy to share the slides, but there are substantial effect sizes, particularly for specific elements of well-being that are associated with different kinds of pro-environmental behaviors, including reductions of one's carbon footprint. And so this leads to the conjecture that the cultivation of well-being may actually facilitate ecological decision-making in ways that can be importantly helpful for the planet. Okay, just a little bit about biophilia and kindness. Both kindness and biophilia are expressed innately and require nurturing to be sustained. This is just an important fact to keep in mind. There is overwhelming evidence now to show that both kindness and biophilia are present at the outset. But just like language, in order for them to be expressed in a mature form, they need to be cultivated. And so this is something that I think is essential in helping to guide the design of our education in order to take into account these innate dispositions. So a little bit about threats to an engaged citizenry. Solastalgia is the existential distress caused by current climate change. And eco-anxiety is the pre-traumatic worry about the future. Both of them are now actually considered diagnosable conditions and represent serious detriments to action. And we need to address this as the efforts to promote an engaged citizenry to deal with the crisis of climate change that we are facing today, and some of the strategies for the cultivation of well-being that I've alluded to, we think can be helpful. So finally, I'll just end with the possibility of AI for well-being, and this is really around the microdosing of well-being, and I'm not talking about the administration of any kind of pharmaceutical. I'm talking about using behavioral strategies to actually, with micro-interventions, that can be seamlessly inserted in a person's everyday life. A 30-second practice to appreciate one's natural environment. A 30-second practice, this is something we've done with school teachers, to remind them of their purpose in becoming teachers in the first place. It is extraordinary what a few minutes a day of this kind will do. One of the things I often remind people of is that when human beings first evolved, none of us were brushing our teeth. Somehow, humanity has figured out how to do that. And it's kind of amazing. It's not part of our genome. But virtually every human being on the planet spends a few minutes each day brushing their teeth. If we spent the same amount of time nurturing our mind, this world would be a different place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was so interesting to listen to these topics that our minds are engaged all these days. From the point of view of a psychiatrist and a psychologist, it is another aspect which is very useful, very important, and we have to think about it and not only brush our teeth, but think for our inner well-being. Thank you. So we come to our next speaker, Professor Nikita Spytis, who is a professor of economics at the University of Piraeus. Ωραία.
Okay. So, with this. Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. So, my topic will be rationality, and I will attempt a very brief description of the evolution of the concept, and I will focus on basically two periods, the modern period, in which we have the modern view of rationality, basically the view of rationality as evolved in the 20th century, and I will compare it with the ancient view of the concept, and especially Plato's view. And I will make a brief reference to David Hume, 18th century, whose views about rationality have marked the evolution of the concept since then. So basically, the modern view, some basic comparisons, the modern view is Humean, whereas the ancient view, the Plato's view, is anti-Humean. In what respect? First of all, let me say that rationality has to do with beliefs and desires. In all those views, rationality is defined in terms of properties that beliefs and desires should have. So, in the modern view, beliefs and desires are primitive concepts. They are not explained by anything more fundamental, and at the same time, they explain our actions, our preferences and our actions and our choices. And also, they are independent. One does not depend on the other. There is no connection between the two. In the Platonic view of rationality, beliefs and desires are not independent. They are explained by something which is more fundamental, and this is the human soul. So now, if we move to the modern view of rationality, the current view puts heavy restrictions, heavy constraints on beliefs, and it puts no constraints on desires. So, rationality of decisions, rationality of actions is solely determined by rationality of beliefs. If your beliefs are rational, then your actions are rational. If your desires are rational, this plays no role in determining the rationality of your actions. So, rational beliefs plus any desires give rise to rational decisions. So we might have rational but immoral decisions, or irrational but moral decisions. The two concepts are unrelated on the modern view of rationality. So, rational beliefs, what's the role of rational beliefs? The role of rational beliefs is to guide our actions toward achieving maximum satisfaction, maximum desire, maximum degree of desire. And this is encoded in what we economists used to say, the expected utility maximization principle. So beliefs in this framework may be thought as a servant of desires. And this is Humean. Okay, David Hume was the first to explicitly say that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. So, what are the rationality constraints, the constraints that rationality puts on beliefs? In fact, it's very heavy, they're severe. First, under the modern view, beliefs come in degrees. And economists used to refer to these degrees as subjective probabilities. Philosophers used to refer to those degrees as credences. So, subjective probabilities, the first constraint of rationality is that the subjective probabilities must be coherent, internally consistent. They must obey a formal calculus. In this case, the probability calculus. And this is not a simple and innocent constraint. That requires the agent to be logically omniscient. The agent must be able to track down all the logical entailments of his language, to be able to track down all tautologies and assign them credence equal to 1, or all the contradictions and put them subjective probability equal to 0. It's a very heavy constraint. And also credences must be accurate in the sense that they must aim at objective probabilities. On the other hand, as I said before, the current view of rationality puts no constraints on beliefs, except that the agent must be able to assign a number which represents his or her utility for a particular outcome. So basically, the agent must be able to define a subjective utility function whose domain is the potential outcomes and the range is the real numbers. So this is, okay, this is not a very, weak constraint, but it's nothing compared to the constraints that are imposed on beliefs. So let's move back to the ancient times and have a look at Plato's view of rationality. So the first big difference is that the Platonic view of rationality puts constraints both on beliefs and on desires. And also, beliefs and desires are not primitives, but they're explained by the tripartite theory of the soul. So the soul consists of 3 parts: reason, spirit, appetite. So beliefs and desires of the rational part only are eligible to be rational or irrational. Beliefs and desires coming from the non-rational part of the soul are not accessible. We cannot say whether they are rational or irrational. They, by definition, non-rational. So, how do you define? How do you find out whether the beliefs or the desires coming from the rational part of the soul are rational or non-rational or irrational? There are 2 activities of the reason. There are 2 goal-oriented activities. Let's call them activity 1 and activity 2. Activity 1 aims at the truth, and activity 2 aims at the goodness. So if activity 1 is successful in achieving its goal, then the corresponding beliefs are rational. In a similar fashion, if activity 2 is successful, then the corresponding desires, they're going to be good desires, so they are rational. So we have rational beliefs and rational desires. So in order to characterize a person as rational, this person must have both rational beliefs and rational desires. So now, this is as far as Plato goes, but now we can start a bit of speculation. So the first question that I would like to address is how can reason pursue A is a proposition, unless it believes that A is true? So let's analyze this question. Assume, let A be a proposition. For each A, one can think of another proposition, A0, which states that A is good. Now, if my credence in A0 is equal to 1, then which means that I have full belief in A0, then and only then I can pursue A via activity 2. Hence, in order for activity 2 to be successful and have rational desire, A0 must indeed be a true proposition, which means that A is objectively good, in which case activity 1 is successful. So, the success of activity 2 depends on the success of activity 1. So, rationality of desires depends on the rationality of beliefs. By doing this, we establish a necessary connection between desires and beliefs, and this is clearly anti-Humean. So these considerations bring us back to the modern view, the modern era, where some philosophers have put forward the idea of desire as belief thesis. The desire as belief thesis says that a rational agent desires something exactly to the extent that she believes it is good. So the utility of A is equal to the credence that this guy, this person, attaches to the associated proposition A0 that A is good. So the question is the desire as belief thesis consistent with our current framework of Bayesian rationality, which is adopted by both philosophers and economists? And here we have some very nice mathematical results by David Lewis, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And David Lewis says no. And he proves the inconsistency of desires belief thesis with the Bayesian epistemology by means of some triviality results. So basically what Lewis showed is that the desires belief thesis plus Bayesian rationality over-constrain the decision maker. So in this case, if decision maker adheres to desires belief thesis, she is unable to update her subjective beliefs using rational learning. Hence, is epistemically paralyzed. So if rejecting Bayesian rationality is not an option, that desires belief thesis must go, and this saves, let's say, the current framework of Bayesian rationality by the introduction of objective ethics. So the desires belief thesis has some profound implications about how we do economics, for example, because if we insist on the maximization of expected utility paradigm, then we have to live with the idea that desires can be immoral. Economics is ethically neutral. Any desires can be rational, can be consistent with rationality. So if we want to adopt a desires belief thesis, which means that I desire something only to the extent that I believe that my object of desire is good, ethics, then economists have to give up the expected utility maximization paradigm. That means the core of their theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pittis, for your interesting presentation of another topic different from all those that they have already listened to. And so the picture is being completed. And so we will welcome Professor Anna Schrift, Professor of Philosophy at Humboldt University of Berlin. I don't know, perhaps Anna Schrift.
Dimitra, if I can briefly say a word. Anna Schriefel sent us an email that because of the medical emergency, she cannot be here, and she truly regrets it. So she's very, very sorry, but she cannot be here, unfortunately. This is very recent. The email just came in.
Thank you, Katja. So you have the information in the other part of the world, and we don't have it. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for to hear this news, and I hope she gets well soon. I'm sure that somebody's taking care of her. I'm sure, but I didn't have this information. I'm sorry. So my best wishes for Anna. And so we will pass to our next speaker, Haris Platanakis, Professor of Political Theory at the University of Athens. Welcome. You can take a breath.
Hi. Thank you.
Are you okay? You are prepared?
Yeah. There must be a PowerPoint. Well, meanwhile, thank you very much for the invitation. It seems that a lot of, well, Aristotle didn't write any treatise on Aristotle didn't write any treatise on leadership, but it seems that leadership scholars, they deal with him a lot. And they come up with some imaginary ways of reconstructions of his moral and political thought, and producing some leadership models that would apply then to business administration, etc. One very important idea in that direction is proposed by Joanna Chula, who suggests that the good leadership is both ethical and effective, and she's claiming as one of her ancestors, Aristotle here. So what I would like to do in this talk is I would like to propose that even though she's looking the right direction, she doesn't look close enough, and she's missing two important, in my eyes, constraints on the ethical component and the effective component. More particular on the ethical component, she seems to ignore the moral psychology and the motivation issues that the Aristotelian story produces, and she doesn't take that into account with negative effects for her theory. And on the effective component, she disregards the limitations of moral lack. So I would like to suggest that if we revise her ideas with those two considerations in mind, we have a much more competitive model of leadership in her direction. A neo-Aristotelian model, but still a very helpful model, I think. So let me start with the ethical component first. And of course, the first thing to start is Aristotle's definition of virtue. I would like to make 3 points here that are relevant for our consideration. First point, it has to do with the virtues and the virtues leader action and choice, which is interpreted as an intermediate between two extreme types of motivation, both of which are vicious. On the one hand, we can have the hard-headed calculation, pure rationality, as our colleague was describing. On the other hand, we'll have the pure irrational passions. We could say that, okay, the first is Kant, the second is Hume, and Aristotle is the intermediate in the middle. And I would like to suggest that we have to get something useful out of this. The second has to do with the situationism of Aristotle, what John McDowell describes as the ethical perception that individuals should have to recognize what's the important thing in the specific situation and not to look for general templates that will apply universally. And I think that, again, in leadership, that's something that seems to be a quite important consideration. And the third one has to do with the significance of phronesis, the ethical practical wisdom. Now here, and that's a follow-up or the other side of what Professor Sachs was telling us before the break, that the Aristotelian phronesis is not the economic prudence, even though quite often we translate it like that. That's one component of the phronesis, is the instrumental component of the phronesis, but the phronesis is doing something else on top of that, which is quite important. It puts the different positive virtues, right conditions, etc. It puts them together in a coherent system, and that I call the architectonic element. So what I would like to suggest is that those three elements can revise Chula's ethical leadership model into something much better, and I'll try to do it here. Okay, business administration people, and they tend to think of virtuousness, not of virtue, I claim, and that's because they're misdirected by Kant and Kant's interpretation of virtue as moderation. But that what I describe here as the deontic approaches or deontic interpretation. But what I would like to suggest is that that's not enough. So the virtuous behavior is not enough for our system. And if we look more closely in Aristotle, we'll see the character traits that ground the virtuous behavior, and that's the important element in my understanding. So to cut the long story short, it seems that the archetype Aristotelian model would offer something both on the ethical and the effective element. On the ethical element, it will not insist only on the perception of the behavior, but it will look on the grounding of that behavior, the character traits. So quite often we do the right thing for the wrong reasons. That will be blocked away, I suspect, by the archetype interpretation, while on the effective component, it will take into account constraints that moral lack or misfortune can bring in our life. So it seems to me that we can, on the ethical component, we can say that, okay, the virtuous leader that we reconstruct from Aristotle's theory would be something like the mean between a manager who operates with calculative reasoning and the tyrant who operates with emotional impulses only. So that's the first bit. The second bit is the effective component. And on that thing, I follow up what Matt Walker was saying us earlier on. I'm not going to discuss the bit that you covered. I was planning to do it, but thank God I deleted it. And I'll concentrate, so I'm not going to talk about the epistemic element, but I'm going to talk more on the application of the phronesis in the political domain. Aristotle himself says that there are two sides of the same coin. The phronesis is on the private ethical domain, and the politiké, the political science, what we could say, is on the political domain. Again, here we have the same idea. We have the same model. We have the architectonic, which will put the different values or value systems of a non-ideal society together, and we have the instrumental, which will help us to deliver what the architectonic goal is. Now, Aristotle has a beautiful analogy for that, is the boat analogy, where he describes the the polis as a boat, and he describes the different rowers who have different capacities, different functions in the society, and so they're instrumental in a sense, and what they bring together, and that's the important thing, it's not the captain who does it, but all the seafarers together is the collective, synergically they come up with the common goal of the society. Now, that's quite crucial. I have it in the passage here. I have tagged the different types of excellence. I call it excellence 1 for the instrumental, excellence 2 for the synergic architectonic one. And now what can we make out of it for the story that Chula suggests? Well, a couple of things. First, I think that we get out of it that the domain of manifestation for leadership is with reference to the character traits. Aristotle has a beautiful analogy in the Politics that as the possession of a lyre cannot cause a good performance without a musical skill, so political power without virtue isn't enough for civic happiness. I think that recapitulates how the two domains are coming together in the interpretation that I propose. The second bit is what we get with political power. In my understanding, in this kind of interpretation, the political power is the amplifier for the virtues or vicious goals of the ethical component, and the ethical perception is a useful instrument to find what's the effective, to find alternative effective paths when you have external constraints to block your aim. And the final bit is what happens with the effectiveness of the leader. Okay, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea that, oh, the leader is effective if she produces measurable results, even though I suspect the social scientists like that idea. Still, there are other elements that approach are missing. So first, it amplifies the ethical message. So in that sense, the inspiration and the motivation of the leader to his fellow citizens is part of the story we have here. And since it's not the one leader who'll do it according to the ship of the state idea, but it's the synergy of all the leaders, it's a more participatory model of leadership compared to the charismatic models of leadership that are or were quite popular in the leadership studies bibliography 20-25 years back. But I'll better stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Platanakis. We thank very much Professor Platanakis for his very vivid, well-organized presentation and with very interesting points and ideas. And it was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, my colleague from Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, Philemon Peonidis, Professor of Philosophy, will be the last, but as I said, not least. Dear Philemon, we look forward to your talk.
In my view, there is one Athenian principle concerning civic education that we moderns have to take seriously into account. This is a very simple idea, and I can present it to you. The idea goes as follows. All citizens are civics educators who, through their public acts and omissions should be a role model for young Athenians. As you know, democratic Athenians did not have official educational institutions that were administered by public authorities. The only thing we find is an institution called Aephoria that was established in 334, and basically, as Aristotle says in his Athenian constitution, it was about a 2-year military training. We don't know if it included civic education, but it is noteworthy that the trainers were elected by the people. However, in any case, this took place only a few years before the fall of the Athenian democracy. However, Athenians had a conception of civic education. One can find an exposition of these conceptions in the 8th book of Politics, of Aristotle's Politics. He says, "No one will doubt that the legislator should direct his attention, above all, to the education of youth, for the neglect of education does harm to the Constitution." So, in my view, this is one of the first instances in which civics education is mentioned for the first time in the Western educational tradition. Now, I will give you a few passages to document this idea, the idea that all citizens are civic educators. The first comes from Plato's Protagoras. Quote, "As now, no one begrudges teaching others things just and lawful, and does not hide them as he might hide other technical matters. I think you see the practice of justice and excellence of individuals toward one another profits us. On account of these things, everyone eagerly talks to everyone and teaches what is just and lawful. And now you are spoiled, Socrates," Protagoras says, "because all are teachers of excellence, each to the extent that he can be, and no one appears to you to be a teacher of it." So I think here Protagoras expresses a common view. Everyone eagerly talks to everyone and teaches what is just and lawful. Of course, Socrates disagrees. The second passage comes from Plato's Apology. So Socrates asks certain questions, and Meletus tries to answer this question. Socrates says, "Tell me, my good sir, who improves our young men?" Answer, "The laws." That is not what I'm asking, but what person who has the knowledge of the laws to begin with? Answer, "This juryman, Socrates." How do you mean, Meletus? Are these able to educate the young and improve them? Answer, "Certainly." All of them or some, but not others? All of them. Very good, by Hera. You mention a great abundance of benefactors, but what about the audience? Do they improve the young or not? Answer, they do too. What about the members of council? The councillors also, Meletus says. But Meletus, what about the assembly? Do members of the assembly corrupt the young, or do they all improve them? Answer, they improve them. All the Athenians, it seems, make the young into fine good men except me, and I alone corrupt them. Is that what you mean? Answer, that is most definitely what I mean. And then Socrates goes on by giving a false analogy, saying that, do you accept that all Athenians are good horse trainers? Of course not, he says, Meletus says. So how do you accept that all Athenians are good civic educators? But I think that this analogy does not go, but this is not my point. My point is that I believe that here Meletus is expressing a common view. And my third example is from Lycurgus the orator, from Against Leocrates. Be aware, gentlemen, that your vote for conviction not only will punish this man today, but will inspire all our younger men to lead a life of virtue. There are too many factors in the education of young men, the punishment imposed on those who do wrong and the rewards given to men of virtue. With an example of each before them, fear leads them to avoid the one, punishment, and desire for fame inspires them to pursue the other. For this reason, gentlemen, you must pay close attention to this trial and place justice ahead of all other considerations. So, as you know, in ancient Athens, there were no professional judges. There were citizen judges, jurors, who were deciding, after hearing both cases, whether a particular citizen is guilty or not. So what Lycurgus is saying, like, be careful, beware, when you are deciding who is guilty or not, have in mind younger people. You set the example to them. And of course, if you want to set the example to them, you have to give a premium to justice. I think, okay, I can quote other passages from Aeschines against Ctesiphon, for instance, but I won't do it. So, the final part of this presentation, what's the situation now in modern advanced democracies? We leave everything concerning civic education to schools and teachers. They are responsible for civic education, and if they fail, they have to take the blame for this because they are lazy, incompetent, and so on. The rest of us have no responsibility for that. Okay, this is not a totally unreasonable position, because schools can offer comprehensive courses taught by experts. Also, they could give them an idea of what is democracy in practice, for instance, by making them electing their representatives, or by making students participating in various democratic school meetings. But this does not suffice. It is important for youngsters, for young people, to live in an environment that is favorable to democracy. To take the case of Greece, for instance, if they live in an environment where their parents are apathetic, or where they listen always that democracy is a sham, politicians are scoundrels, the world is run by multinational companies or various other elites. If they listen all these ideas, if they live to this environment, it's very difficult, no matter how the schools are trying to do their best, it's very difficult to develop democratic attitudes. So, to conclude, the upshot of this discussion is that if we do care about democracy, about the quality of democracy, we have to take into account this piece of ancient wisdom and try to assume our responsibilities for making younger people democratic citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philemon. for this presentation and making us to think about education and pedia, I say again, which is the most important and profound thing. And this is what the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, had in mind when they were referring to pedia. Pedia is something that cultivates people. Education, as we do it today, is only to prepare efficient people to do efficiently their work. So today we should think about bringing pedia into our system as it used to be in ancient times. So with this, we have finished with our speakers, and we have 20 minutes for discussion. And of course, Jeffrey Sachs will be first to share with us his very, very interesting thoughts about all these matters.
Again, thanks to all of the presenters for fascinating papers. And we're collecting everything so everybody can read through them. There should be a Dropbox available for everybody today so that we can look through them and even have time tomorrow after our own reflections. Almost all of the discussion in this second session was about psychology. So the underlying human psychology, both from an ancient and a modern point of view. And I just wanted to reflect on a couple of points, very much along the lines that Nikitas discussed of the ancient and the modern view of rationality, because we use that term in very, very different ways. Modern rationality means instrumental rationality, getting to some defined goal, whatever it is. Ancient rationality is much more, Sophrosiny, much more about practical wisdom. And that is choosing goals wisely and knowing how to operate in a complex environment for ultimate aims. I think what's fascinating for me about both Plato and Aristotle in their psychology is that they intuited or based, in fact, all of their ethics and their psychology on a divided soul. They didn't know exactly what the psyche was. Aristotle, I think, believed that the brain, if I'm not mistaken, was more for ventilation and cooling than it was for thinking, and did not place the mind or the psyche in the brain, so there was no neuroscience involved. But he had the sense, very much, as did Plato, his teacher, that the soul was divided. They divided it slightly differently into three components. For Plato, it was appetitive, spirit, and rationality. And for Aristotle, it was vegetative, animal, locomotive and perceptive, and rational. But there was the idea that there was a rational soul and there were irrational components, and that a great deal of what virtue is having rationality train and hone the irrational part of the soul. So a kind of dualism or tripartite division of the soul. And that's why Aristotle talked about acratic versus encratic personalities. Can you keep your desires, act upon proper beliefs, or operate with self-control, with temperance, with using your rational psyche to control impulses or instincts that would be harmful to you. And he compared human beings to a dog. A dog lives in the moment. doesn't think about the future, reacts instinctively, but a human being can act with rationality. The modern view of behavioral, modern economics, let's just call it that, is that there isn't a divided soul. There is actually, under certain assumptions that we take as given, a unitary soul, which is can be described as a preference ordering or as a utility function in certain mathematical conditions, and you maximize that. And rationality is maximizing a single function. What I believe is fascinating about the Aristotelian and Platonic ideas, though I prefer Aristotle's view, though Plato's writing about it, which is much more artistic, is that a good life is a struggle. That's why it's a skill. There's no skill involved in maximizing a utility function. You just have it and you maximize it. Maybe you have to ask a mathematician to do optimization of your function, but generally you just have your preferences and you try to maximize them subject to your budget constraint. Whereas with Aristotle, you're constantly making choices, decisions. My God, I'm tempted to do this, but that doesn't seem like a good idea. My mentor told me, don't do that. That would be bad for you. I better go back to practicing. I better go back to honing my long-term skills. And that's why the idea is that a good life is through skill formation, not just an operation of addressing one's preferences or beliefs. There's another element that came into this with Hume, which is that not only do individuals have clear preferences, but as I mentioned earlier, don't debate them. They just are what they are, which is even more outrageous. And one of the famous statements of Hume, which is despicable, actually, but is a famous part of British empiricism, is, "'Tis not unreasonable for me to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." And this is a statement in the treatise, A Treatise of Human Nature. That's rational. I want to protect my finger. If the whole world is destroyed because of that, it's still rational for me. Those are my preferences, my finger rather than humanity. Whereas any of us would say that's complete madness. That's not rationality. But the difference is that rationality currently means maximizing your desires. So now to neuroscience and psychology itself. My argument would be that modern psychology and neuroscience, which are two very distinct fields historically and still distinct in methodology to some extent, although now they're deeply intertwined, is much more Aristotelian than Humean, because the main idea, I think, of modern cognitive neuroscience, or even just modern neuroscience, is that the brain is a mixture of different networks. And one of the current ideas, for example, of many neuroscientists is that there's a sharp distinction between wanting and liking, which isn't even a sensible distinction in this economic idea. You like what you want what you like, period. But there are different networks in the brain. One is the subcortical reward network of the dopamine circuit. That's a reward network. That gives you wanting and desire, but the liking is more in the insula or in the prefrontal cortex. Of course, it's all part of larger systems. But the brain is evolved, and it's not evolved as a unitary structure. It's evolved as a mass of evolutionarily adapted circuitry that's quite contradictory. And that's why we feel the tension. God, I'd love to have that cake, but I know it's bad for me. And the drama is what you will do about it. And a lot of the training, for example, to delay gratification in cognitive behavioral therapy is learning to have thinking modes that I think neuroscientifically, my guess is strengthening prefrontal cortex executive control relative to more subcortical networks. Whatever it is, that's my primitive understanding of it. But the basic point is that I think the brain and the psyche are divided. That's why we are, in general, messes, because we're trying to operate in a world where we don't understand our own minds very well. We have no feeling, oh, that was my ventral tegmental area just sending some dopamine to this. We have no conception of what goes on in our minds, and it's pulling us in multiple directions. And what Aristotle and Plato, the charioteer, were telling us, learn to behave, because that way you'll end up with a better life. You'll end up with a good life. So bottom line for me in this discussion is that even though they didn't have any sense of the physical underpinnings or even the phenomenological full nature of these phenomena, Plato and Aristotle were onto something extraordinarily deep, that virtue is a skill. In fact, it's a set of skills. And it's a set of skills because it's not, it's because of our complicated makeup that we need those skills in order to choose well, behave well, operate well, be pro-social. They don't come naturally, they're innate, but they're not the only systems that we have. They're not the only choices that we have, and therefore choosing well is whether you're creating stronger synapses or you're learning behavioral traits or you're improving your virtues and arete, it comes to the same thing in the end, that this is cultivating a mind that can help to engender the good life. So that was just my summary of these different...
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So, sorry, Katja has to say something, yes.
I'll just add a little bit also on kind of related things to the things that Jeffrey was just mentioning on, how we should think of a divided soul or not, and how we should think of rationality. And Nikitas Pittis was mentioning already kind of some arguments against a Humean account of the mind. And I guess I wanted to add that there is also another kind of basic argument that is made based on Plato, based on Aristotle, against the desire-belief distinction that is so important to the Humean model. And so this additional basic argument is that it is simply not true that desire does not have an affective dimension to it, a belief dimension to it, and that belief does not have an affective dimension to it. So for example, certain beliefs, we just kind of like them. We enjoy them. We also kind of enjoy sticking to our beliefs because we are often dogmatic and so on. So people, some beliefs feel good, other beliefs don't feel good, and we don't want them, as it were. So it doesn't seem that belief is, as it were, bare of desire or affect. Rather, there seems to be a kind of feeling or emotional or affective or desiderative layer to belief. And at the same time, there also seems to be, and both Plato and Aristotle think that, a cognitive dimension to desire, because if you desire something, it seems to be one component of desiring something that you see it as good. And that is a kind of quasi-belief dimension or cognitive dimension. So those are additional reasons why people who are influenced by Plato and Aristotle would reject the desire-belief model of the mind. However, they also speak against too deep a division between parts of the soul or the mind. And I totally agree with Jeffrey that today's, as far as I understand it, today's neuroscience and today's psychology is in some sense quite open to Aristotelian or Platonic divisions between parts of the soul or the mind. Nevertheless, it is also important to all of the ancients that the soul is also one, the mind is also one. So in some sense, what they, I think the modern locution that Plato and Aristotle would be most comfortable with is talk about so-called subsystems. And subsystems, let's say the desiderative subsystem or the cognitive subsystem or the perceptual subsystem, they are still subsystems of a bigger system. And that draws attention to the fact that desire and cognition and perception and so on are still interrelated. So even though we can kind of distinguish them and very usefully distinguish them, we also need to, so both Plato and Aristotle would argue that we also need to look at how they are really deeply intertwined, and that it is a mistake to assume that belief is as it were merely cognition, unrelated to anything affective or desiderative, or that desire is kind of merely feeling desire, unrelated to anything cognitive. Anyway, so those are just kind of further reasons from my point of view to take the proposals that we can find in Plato and Aristotle seriously. But unfortunately, I only speak as an expert in ancient Greek thought, and from like all the things that we've heard now also about ancient Chinese thought, I get the sense that there are further really important dimensions that we should kind of bring into that picture. For example, about attention, which came up several times, like making things salient, practices of making things salient and so on. Those ideas are not so much part of the framework in ancient Greek philosophy. And nevertheless, they seem to me for education, for becoming better thinkers and so on, they really seem equally important. So I kind of see the task, if you like, that all of us with this workshop are kind of approaching as, on the one hand, emphasizing connections between ancient Greek frameworks and what we do in psychology and neuroscience today, but also bringing together the two ancient traditions and seeing how that can enrich each other.
Thank you very much, Katja. This was very interesting comparison. And since you are making comparisons, it has already been a comparison between Plato and Aristotle in the field of ethics. And I would just like to point out a small point, which is very important, that Aristotle saw ethics as part of the human nature. This is very important. Plato was very strict and he told us what is the good. This is up there in the heavens. We have to follow the good, the ideal good. It is transcendental, not in the human nature or society. Aristotle, on the other hand, who is, as I like to say, the earthly philosopher in his physics, because he doesn't look to the stars so much, but he looks in nature around him and in all living beings. He does this also with his ethics. He doesn't demand that men, anthropy, human beings should follow the rules of ethics, without taking into account in each particular case of each individual all the situation in which a practical an action has taken place. So he's not so absolute. He takes a good look to human nature, and he tries to make people become virtual by exercise and by repetition in order to create this axis, this tendency to do the good. So there is a big difference between Plato and Aristotle, and I like more Aristotle because he sees human nature. He doesn't ignore all the around situations that might create each case in our behavior and in our everyday life. We have one more, I think we can have one more comment, or and then we can finish with this session.
Hello? Yeah. So as a speaker, I should be getting questions, but actually I have a question. When I first prepared this talk, I actually was having a comment about the comparison between Confucian virtue ethics and Aristotelian virtue ethics for robots. And I argued that Confucian robot ethic is more appropriate because it's society-oriented, and the virtues are mostly about interpersonal relationships. And I also argued that Aristotelian virtue ethics focus on the individual, how to live well. So I just didn't see how Aristotelian virtue can be implemented or can be useful in establishing robot ethics. But then I had second thought. I'm talking to so many Aristotelian scholars, I didn't want to make enemies, so I took that comments out. But I don't expect to have the feedback right now, but for the remainder of the conference, if you have any suggestion how to construct Aristotelian robot ethics, please have a conversation with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like first to thank all our speakers for their excellent presentations and the ideas, fruitful ideas that they have presented, that they give us the opportunity to think about them. And in the future, we can talk about them after having a lot of thinking, because they are very good, very interesting propositions. So I would also like to thank all our colleagues present here during all these hours of this morning for your presence, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs would like to add something. Yes, please, Jeffrey.
Sorry, before we break, I wanted to add to that. I wanted to address you. I wanted to conjecture that Confucian robots and Aristotelian robots would get along very well. So that's a conjecture. And I would point to two parts. One is in the Nicomachean Ethics, chapter 8 is about friendship. So Aristotle defines various kinds of friendships, and I think you would find a lot of robotic wisdom there, or wisdom for robots. Robots should have friends, and Aristotle describes different kinds of friends. And then, of course, the whole politics is about how to live in society. So Aristotelian virtue includes citizenship. In the Nicomachean Ethics, not so much, but in the politics, it's all about citizenship. And so it is this reflexive idea, both of Plato and Aristotle, that you need virtuous leaders to make virtuous citizens, and you need virtuous citizens to sustain virtuous leaders. And that's a neat trick, because we can't get out of vicious circles of bad leaders and unvirtuous citizens, but the virtues of citizenship, I think, make a lot of sense for autonomous robots also. So I think that there could be a lot, but it is part of our purpose to try to guess how they would get along. But my conjecture is they'd get along pretty well, actually.
Okay, so lunch is expecting us outside this door, and don't forget that at 7 o'clock we are invited for dinner at Aikaterini Laskaridis Foundation. So thank you very much again, and have a good afternoon.